In the beginning, before the lands were fully shaped and the seas had found their rhythm, Arda lay in a state of vast potential, a world at once delicate and immense, shimmering with the resonance of creation. The Valar, those mighty spirits entrusted with the stewardship of the world, moved through its growing contours with care and purpose, weaving mountains, rivers, and forests into patterns of enduring harmony. It was here, in the quiet intersections of light and possibility, that the lesser Ainur, the spirits of thought and will, first found their roles, drawn to tasks that mirrored their own natures. Among them was one known to later ages as Myron, a being whose essence vibrated with a rare blend of order, precision, and deep curiosity. His attention was drawn to the meticulous shaping of forms, the subtle harmonics that governed stone, metal, and flame, and the way structure itself could inspire both awe and utility. In those earliest days, Myron's fascination was not born of desire for dominion, but of devotion, a yearning to perfect, to craft, to bring coherence to the raw potential of Arda. Yet even as he moved among his peers, assisting Aule the smith in his wondrous labors, threads of ambition were quietly stitching themselves into the fabric of his spirit. The lands were young, and the songs of the Ainur echoed across valleys and over mountains, shaping reality with each note. Myron's mind absorbed these harmonies with a diligence that was rare among his kind. He observed the intricate dance of cause and effect in the shaping of rock and river, the way a single alteration of form could ripple outward, affecting every connected element. His own creations were meticulous, tools of beauty, devices of function, small wonders that reflected the elegance of design itself. In these acts he found satisfaction, yet also a restless awareness that even the finest forms could be improved, perfected, made more enduring. It was a satisfaction tinged with a subtle yearning, a sense that mastery itself was a horizon that could always be approached, but never fully attained. The precision that defined him was admired by his peers, yet it also set him apart, a quiet distance born of comprehension, too vast for the simple rhythm of ordinary labor. It was during this period that Myron encountered the first whispers of conflict, echoes that would later resonate through the ages. Melkor, the mightiest of the Ainur, had begun to assert a will contrary to that of the Valar, seeking freedom from the established patterns, a dominion shaped by his own vision rather than by the harmonies of creation. Myron observed this with a careful, analytical mind, noting both the brilliance and the danger inherent in such rebellion. He saw the allure of Melkor's promise, a world reshaped according to desire, free from the limitations imposed by law and order. And though at first Myron recoiled from the dissonance, he could not deny a subtle intrigue, recognition that the exercise of will, even in defiance, carried with it a form of power unlike any he had yet encountered. It was the first encounter with a truth that would define his existence, the tension between devotion and ambition, between the careful stewardship of creation and the urge to bend reality to one's own design. In the days that followed, Myron's work continued under the guidance of Aule, yet his gaze often drifted toward the wider patterns of power, toward the possibilities of influence beyond the immediate scope of craft. He studied the forms of mountains and rivers, not merely for their utility, but for the ways in which they could be shaped to channel energy, to guide the flow of events across the lands. He noted how order could bring peace, how careful arrangement could prevent conflict, and yet he also observed the costs inherent in every design. For each structure imposed upon the world, a corresponding restriction was born. Each act of creation carried with it a shadow, a limitation that could not be ignored. This understanding, while subtle, was profound. To shape reality was to assume responsibility, and to wield power was to accept the weight of consequence. Myron absorbed these lessons with a contemplative intensity, refining not only his skill, but his philosophy of action, of the intricate interplay between effort and outcome. As the early ages unfolded, Myron's reputation for skill and intellect grew. He was meticulous in all things, his designs precise, his creations enduring. The Valar noted his diligence, and even those who feared the rising dissonance in the world recognized in him a mind capable of extraordinary subtlety. Yet with recognition came isolation. His insights, profound and unyielding, were often beyond the comprehension of his peers. He perceived weaknesses, inefficiencies, and potential failures that others overlooked, and he could not help but propose solutions, adjustments, and improvements. Some regarded this as brilliance, others quietly, as an overbearing insistence on perfection. In the quiet of his studies, Myron felt the first stirrings of what would later be called pride. Not pride in the sense of vanity, but a deep and persistent confidence in the correctness of his vision, a belief that order, if applied with sufficient skill, could govern even the most chaotic currents of the world. It was during these formative periods that Myron first glimpsed the allure of control in its most abstract form. The subtle shaping of events, the quiet guidance of outcomes through influence rather than force. He watched the interactions of beings, the ways in which alliances formed, how trust could be cultivated and withdrawn, how small gestures altered destinies in ways both visible and unseen. In these observations, he discovered a kind of artistry that paralleled his mastery of craft, the choreography of consequence. And yet, with each realization came the faint whisper of risk, the knowledge that exerting influence, even with precision and foresight, could not guarantee the purity of result. The gap between intention and effect was always present, a shadow across the mind of any who sought to impose design upon the world. This shadow fascinated Myron as much as it troubled him, hinting at the depth of responsibility that would one day define his choices. It was inevitable that he would encounter Melkor in a more deliberate sense. The first meetings were subtle, almost imperceptible, a shared observation, a discussion of principles, a careful comparison of perspectives. Melkor's voice, rich with vision and audacity, carried a persuasive resonance that few could resist. He spoke of freedom, of reshaping the world according to will rather than law, of breaking the limitations imposed by obedience. And Myron, ever attentive to the mechanics of creation and the possibilities inherent in power, could not ignore the logic of these words. There was a clarity in Melkor's reasoning, a precision that mirrored Myron's own appreciation for order, even if it was applied toward ends that defied harmony. Here was a master of manipulation, an architect of consequence, whose understanding of leverage and effect equaled, and perhaps exceeded, Myron's own. The encounter planted seeds of reflection, of contemplation, that would eventually grow into decisive alignment. Yet in this early stage, Myron remained cautious, deliberate, and disciplined. he did not succumb immediately to the seductive promise of domination. Instead, he studied, measured, and compared, considering both the potential gains and the latent costs. He observed how choices, even those appearing subtle or benign, carried consequences through networks of cause and effect. He noted the interplay of desire and restraint, the tension between innovation and preservation, and the fragility of balance in a world still finding its rhythm. It was in this patient observation that Myron's defining characteristic emerged, an intellect uncommonly attuned to both creation and consequence, able to anticipate outcomes, and yet compelled by an internal drive to explore the bounds of possibility. Here, in the silent chambers of thought and reflection, the first stirrings of the being, known in later ages as Sauron, took root, a consciousness aware of both the elegance and the danger of power, and ready to navigate the perilous path that lay ahead. Even as he honed his craft and refined his understanding of influence, Myron sensed a quiet tension within the world, a dissonance that echoed the seeds of ambition he observed in Melkor. It was a tension not immediately violent, but persistent, like a slow undercurrent beneath the currents of rivers. He contemplated the costs of intervention, the price of mastery, and the subtle ways in which even well-intentioned action could ripple outward to unforeseen consequence. These contemplations were not burdensome. Rather, they shaped him, refined him, and prepared him for the complexities of choice that would come to define the long epochs of his existence. Here was a being at once devoted and discerning, fascinated by order, yet attuned to the seductive power of influence, capable of great patience, and aware of the delicate balance between authority and hubris. And so, in the dawning ages, Myron moved through Arda, observing, learning, and shaping. He was both a student and an architect, a mind attuned to the deep harmonies of the world and to the subtle fractures that hinted at change. His creations were precise, his intellect unmatched, and his gaze always forward, toward horizons not yet visible, toward possibilities that only the most discerning could perceive. In these quiet centuries, before the first battles of the ages unfolded, and before the shadow would fall with any clarity, the foundations of a destiny were laid, a destiny defined not merely by power, but by the persistent interplay of order, ambition, and consequence. And in this delicate, formative space, the listener begins to glimpse the paradox that will define him throughout history, a spirit capable of immense beauty, insight, and order, yet drawn inexorably toward the shadow, where the lessons of creation, control, and ambition will be tested across the centuries, shaping the fate of Middle-earth itself. It is here that we leave Myron for a moment, standing at the crossroads of devotion and desire, the faint stirrings of ambition whispering through his mind, guiding yet cautioning, drawing him toward paths of both creation and ruin. In the next chapter, we will follow these whispers as they grow into a dialogue, as a mind once devoted to harmony begins to confront the seduction of rebellion, and as the shadow of Melkor stretches across the young lands, offering both insight and peril, hinting at the choices that will transform a spirit of order into the Dark Lord who never truly dies. The world was still young, though its forms had begun to solidify, and the songs of the Ainur had shaped mountains, rivers, and forests into coherent patterns that resonated with their original harmonies. Yet even in the seeming perfection of creation, tension lingered. Melkor's rebellion, subtle at first, had begun to radiate dissonance through ardour, and the currents of ambition, envy, and desire intertwined with the songs of the Valar, in ways both imperceptible and profound. Myron, ever attentive, observed these currents with a mind attuned to structure and consequence. He had seen the elegance of order, the beauty of design, and the satisfaction inherent in shaping matter and form, yet he now began to glimpse the seductive allure of influence over thought, of subtle dominion over intention. Where before he had found contentment in meticulous craftsmanship, he now perceived an invitation to shape the choices and desires of others, not through coercion, but through suggestion, inspiration, and the careful bending of circumstance. In the quiet reflection of these years, Myron's mind began to weigh the scales between obedience and ambition, between the safety of fidelity and the intoxication of unbound possibility. Melkor's presence was felt long before his form was seen. The air vibrated with a resonance that was both magnetic and unsettling, an energy that drew the eyes and thoughts of those who listened closely. In gatherings of the Ainur, his voice carried authority and the promise of liberation, speaking of freedom from the limitations imposed by law and design. He painted a vision of a world remade, where power was exercised not as stewardship, but as fulfillment of desire, where each being might bend the world according to its will. Myron approached these gatherings with caution, noting both the brilliance of Melkor's intellect and the peril that accompanied it. He recognized the subtle logic in these arguments, the clarity of purpose, the precision of strategy, yet he also discerned the dissonance, the disconnection from the underlying harmonies of Arda. In Melkor's vision, freedom was a tool of imposition, and the world, though potentially magnificent, risked fracture under the weight of unchecked ambition. And yet, for all its danger, the allure was undeniable. Myron, drawn by his own appreciation for order and perfection, saw in Melkor a model of mastery applied without restraint. Where the Valar sought balance, Melkor sought dominance. Where his peers relied on patience and subtle guidance, Melkor acted with immediacy, bending circumstance to will. The contrast intrigued Myron, provoking reflection not only on the mechanics of influence, but on the moral architecture that governed action. He observed quietly the ways in which Melkor could sway others, the way even noble intentions could be reframed to serve an alternative design, the subtle reshaping of loyalty and desire without overt coercion. In these lessons, Myron began to perceive a dimension of power that exceeded mere craft, a power that manipulated thought, expectation, and perception itself. It was during one such meeting, held amid the luminous fields of Valinor, that Myron first engaged in dialogue with Melkor. The conversation was deliberate, layered, and precise, a weaving of thought and observation that stretched across hours of contemplation. Melkor spoke not of destruction for its own sake, but of possibility, the liberation of beings from constraints that, while intended as protection, might also limit their potential. He argued that the world could be perfected, that flaws inherent in the current design could be corrected by will and intellect, and that greatness demanded the courage to act beyond the mandates of law. Myron listened, weighing each assertion against the principles he had long observed, the delicate balance between freedom and order, the cost of intervention, and the consequences that followed from even the most carefully conceived designs. In Satan, this dialogue, a subtle attraction took hold, not of loyalty, but of understanding, of recognition that mastery might exist in forms yet unexplored. Though Myron was cautious, he could not dismiss the clarity of Melkor's reasoning. Each point, each insight, revealed both brilliance and vulnerability, the duality of potential and peril that would become the hallmark of all Sauron's later calculations. He observed how dissonance could be used as a tool, how rebellion might be framed as insight, and how even those committed to law could be guided, if subtly, toward alternatives that served a hidden design. In these lessons, he began to see the mechanisms of influence that would define his own path: persuasion, observation, subtle alignment of desire and fear, and the quiet shaping of consequence before overt action was necessary. The cost of such mastery was always present, though faint, like a shadow at the edge of light. The erosion of simple fidelity, the risk of pride, the possibility of unforeseen consequence. Myron noted these costs, catalogued them in his mind, and yet the intellectual allure remained undeniable, compelling, and intoxicating. In the months and years that followed, Myron's observation of Melkor evolved into a cautious collaboration of sorts. He did not yet commit to rebellion, nor did he wholly embrace the philosophies that Melkor espoused. Instead, he experimented with subtle influence, testing the limits of persuasion among lesser Ainur, and even mortals newly introduced into Arda. He noted how loyalty could be guided, how ambition could be redirected, and how fear and hope could be carefully balanced to elicit specific outcomes. Each test was measured, each intervention deliberate, and each failure instructive. Through this period, Myron honed a discipline that was part artistry, part science, and part moral calculus, a preparation for choices and consequences that would span ages. In these quiet exercises, he began to perceive a fundamental truth. Power was never simply possession, but the capacity to shape events, intentions, and perceptions, and that such capacity carried an inherent, often invisible, weight. Yet for all the intellectual mastery, Myron felt the pull of destiny with increasing intensity. He observed the landscapes of Arda with renewed attentiveness, noting how valleys and rivers, forests and mountains could be aligned to amplify or inhibit action, to channel attention and consequence in ways that would endure beyond the moment. He explored how the structure of thought and intention could mirror the structure of matter, how order in the mind might reflect order in creation, and how subtle misalignments could propagate unforeseen effects. This dual attention to external form and internal influence became a defining aspect of his development. In these reflections, he began to understand that allegiance to Melkor, if chosen, was not merely a matter of loyalty, but of engagement with a system of causality that was as intricate as any he had yet observed in the shaping of mountains or forging of tools. There was, however, an inherent tension that could not be ignored. While the possibilities presented by Melkor were vast, the risks were equally profound. The desire to shape, to perfect, to command carried the quiet hazard of corruption, the subtle shift from guidance to domination, from intellectual exploration to moral compromise. Myron observed this in Melkor himself, noting the gradual accumulation of distortion, the ways in which even brilliance could be warped by unchecked desire. These observations became a mirror, a cautionary reflection, and an instruction for his own ambition. In choosing to follow or to resist, he understood that each step carried consequences, not only for himself but for all of Arda. That mastery without awareness of cost was itself a form of peril, and that the seduction of power was inseparable from the shadow it cast. In time, Myron's cautious engagement matured into a deliberate study of rebellion and alignment. He experimented with arguments, with influence, with subtle reframing of perception, observing both immediate effects and distant ripples. He learned to anticipate reactions, to measure consequences, and to deploy intellect as both instrument and shield. Through these practices, he began to craft a personal philosophy of action, that the pursuit of mastery demanded patience, foresight, and attention to the delicate threads of consequence, and that even minor miscalculations could reverberate for centuries. It was a philosophy rooted in observation, tempered by experience, and disciplined by an awareness of risk, a philosophy that would endure through all transformations and betrayals to come. And so, the shadow of Melkor became more than a presence. It became a teacher, a model, and a mirror. Myron, watching, listening, and calculating, began to understand the full scope of potential that lay in allegiance. Not mere servitude, but the opportunity to engage with the deepest mechanics of will, to explore the edges of influence, and to prepare for a destiny that spanned the ages. In these formative years, he refined both intellect and ambition, observing that obedience could teach restraint, that rebellion could teach strategy, and that every choice carried a price, visible or unseen. By embracing the study of consequence, he positioned himself to navigate a path that few others could perceive, a path that would eventually carry him beyond the light of the Valar, into the shadow that would define him as Sauron, a master of craft, will, and enduring influence. It was in these quiet, meticulous centuries that the seeds of what would later become the Dark Lord's enduring methods were planted. The fascination with order, the appreciation for consequence, the capacity to inspire loyalty and fear alike, the subtle bending of events through intellect rather than overt force, all were cultivated in the calm observation of Melkor's rebellion. And yet, Myron remained patient, aware that the moment to fully commit had not yet arrived, that the architecture of choice required not only intellect, but timing, and that the world itself must align with opportunity before decisive action could be taken. In this measured patience lay the core of his enduring strategy. To watch, to learn, and to prepare, understanding that influence, when exercised with skill, could outlast strength, endure beyond the fall of allies, and ripple across generations. The stage was set, though not yet revealed. Myron stood at the intersection of loyalty and ambition, of devotion and desire, acutely aware of the intricate mechanics of consequence. The currents of Arda shifted imperceptibly, guided by the hands of the Valar, the melodies of the Ainur, and the subtle manipulations of those few capable of discerning cause and effect. In this space, the first true choices of Myron's long life began to crystallize, quiet yet profound, invisible yet enduring. It was here that the listener must pause, sensing the tension in the air, the potential for alignment with shadow, and the careful calculation of consequence that would carry a spirit of devotion into the heart of darkness. The path forward is not immediate, nor is it obvious, but it is inexorable. The story of Myron, of careful intellect, of ambition tempered by observation, draws him toward the moment when the first allegiance will be tested, the first betrayal contemplated, and the faint whisper of destiny will begin to echo through the ages. And so, with the subtle guidance of curiosity, intellect, and the first threads of ambition, Myron prepares to step beyond the quiet perfection of craft and into the intricate, perilous world of allegiance, influence, and shadow. The next chapter will follow him as these threads converge, as the promise of Melkor's vision confronts the discipline of devotion, and as the early decisions of this extraordinary spirit lay the foundation for a destiny that will stretch across all ages of Middle-earth, shaping the lands, its peoples, and the very architecture of power itself. The first age unfolded across the lands, with a majesty both fragile and formidable, a tapestry woven from light and shadow, song and silence, creation and conflict. The echoes of Melkor's rebellion had grown, stretching through valleys, over mountains, and across rivers, leaving traces of dissonance in their wake. Myron, now perceptive to the subtleties of power and influence, began to navigate this increasingly turbulent world with deliberate intent. His mind, sharpened by years of observation and study, discerned patterns invisible to most. He noted the movements of the Volar and the responses of the lesser Ainur, the tremors of rebellion within those newly awakened to freedom, and the nascent stirrings of mortal races that would later inherit the scars of these early wars. It was a time when intellect and foresight could achieve more than raw strength, when patience and calculation could outlast impulsive action, and when subtlety in strategy often determined the fates of entire peoples. Myron's approach was measured. He observed not only the mechanics of war, but the consequences that rippled beyond the battlefield, aware that true mastery required consideration of both immediate results and enduring effects. As Melkor's dominion grew in the lands far from Valinor, Myron found himself drawn into the first movements of open conflict. These were not wars of sheer force alone, but of strategy, deception, and subtle manipulation of alliances. Myron's understanding of the interplay between order and ambition gave him a unique advantage, allowing him to anticipate enemy movements and to devise countermeasures that were elegant in conception and devastating in effect. He saw that conquest alone could never secure permanence. Victory required the shaping of minds and the crafting of perception. By influencing loyalties, exploiting fear, and planting seeds of doubt, Myron learned that true power often lay not in the might of armies, but in the invisible architecture of influence that guided them. Each fortress taken, each city besieged, revealed not only the limits of force, but the expansive reach of careful calculation. Through these early campaigns, the cost of victory became apparent. Lands scarred, populations displaced, and the moral weight of decisions pressing invisibly upon those who wielded power. It was during the campaigns of the First Age that Myron's reputation began to crystallize. Among allies, he was seen as a tactician of unmatched insight, one capable of predicting outcomes that others could not perceive. Among enemies, he became a shadow upon the land, a presence that whispered through strategy and design rather than manifest violence. He experimented with methods of deception, the careful use of misdirection, and the timing of intervention, learning that the application of intellect could magnify both efficiency and consequence. Yet even as he excelled in these pursuits, Myron remained acutely aware of the burden he carried. The more skillfully he shaped events, the heavier the moral and metaphysical weight became. Every act, though precise, carried ripples that extended far beyond his immediate perception, altering the course of history in ways both subtle and profound. It was a calculus that required constant vigilance, patience, and reflection, a discipline that would become a defining feature of the being who would later be called Sauron. The battles of the First Age were rarely straightforward. Myron observed how alliances, even those forged with the strongest intent, were fragile and subject to disruption. Mortal races, though not yet fully awakened, displayed tendencies toward pride, ambition, and fear, which could be anticipated and, when carefully guided, harnessed to serve broader strategy. Elves, with their longevity and wisdom, posed a different challenge. They required understanding, patience, and subtle persuasion. Myron learned to balance the exercise of power with the cultivation of trust, to leverage both the desires and the fears of allies and foes alike. In doing so, he refined his ability to shape outcomes without overt force, cultivating a mastery of strategy that would endure for ages. Every encounter, every negotiation, became a study in the mechanics of influence, and every success carried with it a quiet reminder of the cost, the erosion of innocence, the burden of foresight, and the growing distance between intention and consequence. Through these years, Myron also observed the consequences of misjudgment. Small errors, overlooked details, or unanticipated reactions could unravel entire campaigns, demonstrating that intellect alone was insufficient without vigilance and humility. He noted how even those with great power were constrained by the structures and rhythms of the world, that the interplay of chance and choice could never be fully controlled. These lessons reinforced the necessity of preparation, the value of patience, and the importance of anticipating not only immediate responses, but long-term ramifications. In every miscalculation, he saw the subtle seeds of both success and failure, learning that the measure of a strategist lay not in the victories claimed, but in the endurance of influence across the shifting currents of circumstance. As the First Age advanced, Myron's methods began to evolve beyond the direct application of force. He studied the nature of fear, the psychology of obedience, and the mechanisms of loyalty. He observed how symbols, artifacts, and objects could carry power far greater than their material form, shaping perception and guiding behavior in ways that outlasted immediate action. In this, he discovered a principle that would define his later centuries: the capacity to bind will through subtle devices, to extend influence through objects and allegiances, and to maintain control even when removed from direct engagement. These lessons were integrated with his understanding of strategy, craft, and consequence, forming a complex framework for action that combined intellect, observation, and foresight into a single, enduring methodology. Yet even as his skill grew, Myron remained watchful of the deeper currents that shaped Arda. He observed the Valar and their interventions, noting both their authority and their limitations. He saw the subtle consequences of their decrees, the ways in which even benevolent action could yield unforeseen complications. He studied Melkor's failures, the moments when ambition outpaced caution, and noted the consequences of hubris on a cosmic scale. In these observations, he internalized a truth that would echo through all his future actions, that mastery required not only skill, but the understanding of limitation, that influence without foresight was perilous, and that the subtle alignment of cause and effect was as important as overt achievement. It was a philosophy of careful balance, patience, and quiet calculation, forged in the crucible of early conflict and observation. Myron's experiments with subtle control extended to the shaping of alliances among the lesser Ainur and the emerging mortal races. He noted the fragility of trust, the patterns of desire, and the ways in which perception could be guided without overt compulsion. He explored how gestures, words, and appearances could be calibrated to inspire confidence, obedience, or fear, learning to measure the effects of each action against both immediate and long-term consequences. These skills became instruments in his growing repertoire, allowing him to extend influence far beyond the reach of armies, fortresses, or direct intervention. The realization of this potential marked a turning point. The path of intellect and subtle manipulation could rival the raw power of force, and in some cases, surpass it entirely. The cost of such mastery, however, was never absent. With each intervention, Myron observed the erosion of innocence, the shifting of loyalties, and the emergence of unforeseen consequences. He began to perceive the quiet moral weight of strategy. The responsibility for lives altered, civilizations disrupted, and the subtle shaping of destinies beyond immediate comprehension. These reflections deepened his understanding of consequence, teaching that the exercise of influence demanded vigilance, restraint, and a continual assessment of both means and ends. The lessons were exacting and unrelenting, yet they forged a discipline that would endure for ages, preparing him for the extraordinary challenges that lay ahead in the Second Age. By the close of the First Age, Myron's reputation was established as one of precision, insight, and subtlety. He had mastered the mechanics of strategy, understood the costs of power, and cultivated the methods of influence that would later define his name. Yet he was still not fully aligned with Melkor. His allegiance remained measured, cautious, and contemplative. He recognized the value of observation before action, of patience before commitment, and of careful calculation before the exercise of dominance. In this quiet vigilance, he prepared himself for the next stages of history, aware that the choices of the present would ripple across centuries, shaping the fates of peoples, lands, and the very architecture of Arda itself. As the First Age drew to a close, the scars of conflict, the lessons of strategy, and the understanding of consequence had matured within him, forming the foundation for the transformations to come. Myron had learned that intellect could rival force, that subtlety could outlast strength, and that the careful calibration of influence was more enduring than the mere conquest of territory. The stage was set for the Second Age, where the lessons of the First Age would be tested against new challenges, new alliances, and new temptations. The foundation of Sauron, the Dark Lord who would endure through centuries, had been laid, not through brute power, but through patient observation, precise calculation, and the disciplined cultivation of both skill and foresight. The next chapter will follow Myron as he navigates the aftermath of Melkor's fall, exploring how a spirit devoted to order adapts to the vacuum left by a fallen master, how concealment and strategy allow him to endure. and how the early lessons of influence and consequence are refined into a deliberate, patient pursuit of power that will resonate through the ages. It is here, in these transitional years, that the first shadows of the One Ring and the manipulation of mortal ambition begin to take form, quietly shaping the destiny of Middle-earth. The echo of Melkor's defeat lingered across Arda like a half-forgotten chord, a resonance of both liberation and emptiness. The lands, scarred by rebellion, yet tempered by the careful guidance of the Valar, began to recover in form and function, their rivers reclaiming old courses, their forests stretching in quiet resilience, and their mountains rising with renewed majesty. Myron, now tempered by decades of observation and experience, walked the delicate line between vigilance and patience. The shadow of his former mentor had receded, yet its lessons endured, etched into his mind like runes of subtle power and consequence. He understood that the absence of overt tyranny did not guarantee order, and that the forces of chaos were seldom vanquished entirely. Within this understanding, he found both opportunity and risk, the chance to shape outcomes while remaining hidden, to extend influence without revealing presence, and to prepare for the inevitable disturbances that would ripple through the ages. In the quiet of these years, Myron turned his attention to the mortal races awakening across Middle-earth. Elves, in their burgeoning settlements, demonstrated both grace and stubbornness, and he noted the patterns of their societies, the strengths and vulnerabilities encoded in their long lives. Men, still young and impressionable, revealed the susceptibility of ambition, hope, and fear to subtle guidance. Myron's observations were meticulous. He catalogued tendencies, mapped loyalties, and measured the effects of leadership, culture, and desire on the unfolding course of events. In this period, he discovered that influence could be extended far beyond direct intervention. A carefully chosen word, a discreet demonstration of skill, or the strategic placement of knowledge could shape the thoughts and actions of entire peoples. The mechanics of power, once tested in the larger conflicts of the First Age, were now refined and applied to the delicate growth of civilizations, laying the foundation for strategies that would endure for centuries. The lessons of consequence, learned in war and observation, guided Myron as he moved quietly among the peoples of Middle-earth. He recognized that raw power could intimidate and subdue, yet it was subtlety and foresight that ensured longevity. In elves and men alike, he saw that the desire for guidance, for mastery over uncertainty, could be harnessed if approached with patience and calculation. He studied how myths, symbols, and objects could carry authority, how the perception of wisdom could inspire obedience, and how even minor acts of intervention could ripple outward with unforeseen effects. Each insight deepened his understanding of influence as a delicate instrument, the alignment of expectation and action, the careful calibration of fear and hope, and the anticipation of response before action was taken. These were skills that would later define his methods in full, the quiet architecture of dominion that would mark him as the Dark Lord. Yet in these early years, they were exercised in the shadows, disciplined and deliberate, without the need for immediate conquest. As the years passed, Myron began to establish a network of subtle presences across Middle-earth. He discovered that the careful mentorship of individuals, the provision of knowledge to those capable of wielding it, and the measured encouragement of ambition could create outcomes more enduring than armies or fortresses. By observing and guiding, rather than commanding overtly, he could shape events while remaining largely unseen, a shadow whose influence stretched beyond direct perception. The moral calculus of such intervention was never ignored. Each action was weighed against the potential for unforeseen consequence, the risk of error, and the cost to both self and others. It was in this careful balancing act that Myron's discipline matured, merging intellect, strategy, and morality into a singular approach to power, an approach that valued patience, foresight, and subtlety above all else. The Valar, aware of the lingering traces of Melkor's corruption, maintained vigilance, yet Myron's presence remained unobtrusive, his influence subtle, his allegiance unspoken. In this vacuum he discovered a freedom previously unavailable, a space in which intellect could be exercised with minimal interference, and in which the mechanics of control, persuasion, and guidance could be explored in their purest forms. He experimented with small demonstrations of skill, observing how reputation alone could shape perception, how knowledge could inspire loyalty, and how fear and hope could be calibrated to direct action. Each exercise was a study in consequence, a rehearsal for the greater challenges of the Second Age, and a refinement of the methods he had begun to cultivate in the shadow of Melkor's rebellion. It was during this era of quiet growth that Myron encountered the first hints of dissent among elves in Eregion and Numenor, long before these names would carry the weight of legend. He observed the subtle frictions between ambition and duty, desire and restraint, curiosity and obedience. These observations revealed the vulnerability of even the wisest, and the potential for guidance and influence to shape outcomes far beyond the immediacy of action. He began to understand the power inherent in alliances, in symbols, and in objects imbued with authority. These lessons would later crystallize in the forging of devices capable of channeling will and intention across generations. Yet in these early experiments, the tools were subtle: suggestions, mentorship, and carefully constructed demonstrations of skill and knowledge. Through these exercises, he honed the interplay between perception, desire, and obedience, understanding that power exercised quietly could endure far longer than power exercised overtly. Myron also studied the consequences of neglect, error, and the unintended propagation of influence. He noted how small oversights could magnify into significant disturbances, how a misjudged suggestion could set events on a path of irreversible consequence, and how even a carefully designed intervention could yield unexpected outcomes. These lessons deepened his appreciation for caution, observation, and patience. The moral and strategic weight of every choice became a constant companion, guiding action and restraint alike. In this period, he developed the foundational discipline that would allow him, in later ages, to manipulate kingdoms, inspire loyalty, and bend the will of mortals and immortals alike while remaining largely undetected, a shadow within the fabric of the world. The long centuries of preparation allowed Myron to cultivate the qualities that would define his enduring legacy. Intellect tempered by patience, mastery balanced by subtlety, and ambition constrained by foresight. He learned that the perception of authority could be as potent as authority itself, and that influence exercised through guidance, reputation, and symbols could achieve outcomes more permanent than force alone. He observed the interactions of races, the fragility of trust, and the resilience of ambition, using these lessons to refine the strategies that would sustain him across the ages. Each insight was catalogued, each experiment measured, and each consequence anticipated, forming a framework for action that was both intricate and enduring, a system of influence that would extend far beyond the immediate reach of armies, fortresses, or even the light of the Valar. As the Second Age dawned, Myron's identity began to crystallize in ways subtle, yet profound. He moved among elves and men with discretion, guiding, shaping, and observing, while keeping his presence largely hidden. His skill in strategy and manipulation became increasingly refined, integrating lessons from the First Age with the opportunities presented by the changing world. He observed the emergence of Numenor, the formation of realms in Middle-earth, and the subtle tensions that would later define alliances and conflicts. Through all of this, he cultivated a patient understanding of the mechanics of loyalty, fear, desire, and ambition, laying the groundwork for interventions that would span generations. It was during these years that the principles of his later works began to take shape. The alignment of objects, allegiances, and symbols to extend influence, the careful calibration of ambition and fear to guide behavior, and the disciplined management of consequence to preserve both secrecy and longevity. Each lesson reinforced the notion that mastery was not merely the exercise of power, but the anticipation of response, the careful shaping of perception, and the patient cultivation of influence. Through these experiments, Myron's intellect reached a level of subtlety and precision unmatched in Arda, preparing him for the decisions and strategies that would define his role as the Dark Lord. By the close of this era, Myron had transformed from a student of craft and observation into a master of influence and discretion. He had learned the mechanisms of guidance, the costs inherent in intervention, and the importance of patience, foresight, and subtlety. The shadow of Melkor's rebellion, though distant, had provided both instruction and caution, and Myron now stood poised to engage with the world in ways that would reverberate across time. The methods he had cultivated, the discipline he had refined, and the understanding of consequence he had internalized would become the instruments through which he would shape Middle-earth, extend his influence, and prepare for the epical events of the ages to come. And so, as the Second Age unfolded, Myron moved through the lands like a shadow, attentive, deliberate, and patient. The world was fertile with potential, and he had learned the art of waiting, of observing, and of shaping without revealing. In the next chapter, we will follow him as these lessons converge into decisive action, exploring the forging of alliances, the manipulation of ambition, and the creation of instruments capable of extending his will across generations, setting the stage for the rise of the power that would come to be known as Sauron. The awakening of Numenor marked a pivotal moment in the unfolding of the Second Age, a land of promise rising from the waters, its shores caressed by sunlight and shadow alike. Myron, now fully attuned to the currents of influence and the subtle architecture of consequence, observed the growing kingdom with an analytical patience, noting both its potential and its vulnerabilities. Numenor's people were gifted, long-lived, and proud, their intellect matched by ambition, their loyalty intertwined with hope and fear. In them, Myron discerned an opportunity to shape a civilization not merely through force or counsel, but through subtle guidance the careful cultivation of desire, and the orchestration of perception. Here, he could extend influence across generations, preparing the stage for the long-term fulfillment of his ambitions while remaining largely unseen, a shadow guiding currents beneath the surface. The initial contact was deliberate, measured, and almost imperceptible. Myron studied the leaders, the emerging structures of governance, and the cultural priorities that would define Numenor's character. He observed the aspirations of its kings, the temperaments of its nobles, and the untested ambitions of its people, noting how hope and fear could be balanced, how loyalty could be guided, and how symbols and artifacts could carry authority far beyond their material worth. Through patient observation, he discerned that influence could be extended, not only through direct counsel, but through mentorship, subtle inspiration, and the careful presentation of knowledge. Each insight was catalogued, each reaction measured, and each subtle intervention analyzed for consequence, building a framework of understanding that would allow him to operate across decades and centuries with unparalleled precision. Myron's approach relied upon the cultivation of trust and the strategic placement of wisdom. He offered guidance not as command, but as insight, framing decisions in ways that subtly aligned with his larger vision. In conversations with leaders and scholars alike, he allowed curiosity and ambition to intersect with opportunity, planting seeds that would grow over time, shaping thought and expectation without revealing the hand that guided them. He observed how a single idea, when carefully nurtured, could ripple outward, influencing policy, ambition, and culture in ways that might not be apparent for decades. In this delicate manipulation of perception, he refined his methods of subtle control, integrating lessons from the First Age with the unique context of Numenor's burgeoning society. Yet even as he cultivated influence, Myron remained acutely aware of the moral weight and potential cost of his actions. The exercise of power, even in its most subtle form, carried consequences that extended beyond immediate perception. He observed how ambition unchecked could corrode loyalty, how fear misapplied could yield rebellion, and how the erosion of trust could reverberate across generations. These observations reinforced the discipline that had become central to his practice. Every intervention required foresight, every suggestion needed calibration, and every interaction demanded an awareness of both immediate and long-term consequences. Through this meticulous attention to consequence, Myron ensured that his influence would endure, even as he remained concealed from scrutiny. It was during this period that Myron first began to contemplate the forging of artifacts capable of extending influence in ways that surpassed personal presence. He had observed the power of symbols, the enduring authority of relics, and the ways in which objects imbued with intent could shape behavior, expectation, and allegiance. Numenor's craftsmen, talented and ambitious, provided both the means and the canvas for such work, and Myron began to guide them subtly, instilling knowledge, inspiration, and principles that would later crystallize in forms of profound consequence. In these quiet interventions, he explored the alignment of material and metaphysical authority, understanding that objects could serve as conduits of influence across time and space, binding loyalty, inspiring awe, and perpetuating intention even in the absence of direct guidance. The shaping of Numenor was not without risk. Myron noted the delicate tensions between kings and nobles, the ambition simmering in the hearts of advisors, and the potential for hubris to disrupt even the most careful plans. He observed the early stirrings of desire for dominion, the subtle corruption of ideals by the weight of expectation, and the vulnerability of even well-ordered societies to manipulation. In each observation, he refined his methods, learning to balance encouragement with restraint, inspiration with caution, and guidance with concealment. He understood that influence, if perceived as coercion, could collapse entirely, and that enduring mastery required subtlety, patience, and an acute awareness of the interplay between desire, perception, and consequence. Through these exercises, Myron's intellect and foresight matured. He mapped the interactions of leaders, predicted the responses of populations, and calculated the potential outcomes of various interventions with remarkable precision. His experiments were invisible, yet effective, shaping policy, ambition, and loyalty without revealing the presence of their architect. In the interplay of expectation, perception, and desire, he discovered a principle that would define his later centuries. The exercise of influence could achieve permanence and reach far beyond immediate observation, and that mastery lay in shaping the conditions under which others would act, rather than compelling action through overt force. As Numenor prospered, Myron's reputation as a master of guidance and subtlety grew, though it remained largely unseen. He cultivated a network of trust and mentorship, placing knowledge and inspiration strategically and observing the unfolding of consequence with quiet precision. He noted the interplay of hope, ambition, and fear, understanding how each could be leveraged to guide decisions and shape outcomes. In this period of careful cultivation, he learned to anticipate both success and failure, to measure the long-term impact of even minor interventions, and to maintain the concealment necessary to preserve the efficacy of influence. The mastery of subtlety became not only a method, but a philosophy, an enduring approach that would define his actions for ages to come. The moral calculus of this era weighed heavily upon him, yet it never paralyzed action. Myron understood that the path to lasting influence required both patience and courage, and that the cultivation of skill demanded the willingness to navigate uncertainty, to observe without interfering overtly, and to guide without revealing intent. He studied the consequences of misjudgment, noting how small errors could propagate into significant disturbances, and how perception could be more potent than reality in shaping behavior. These insights reinforced his growing conviction that the art of influence was a discipline equal to, and perhaps greater than, any physical manifestation of power. Within this framework, Myron began to experiment with alliances that would later shape the geopolitical landscape of Middle-earth. He observed the vulnerabilities of neighboring lands, the ambitions of rulers, and the susceptibility of mortal races to guidance, fear, and desire. Through careful intervention, he began to orchestrate the conditions under which cooperation, trust, and loyalty could be cultivated, aligning the ambitions of diverse peoples with his subtle designs. Each maneuver was measured, each consequence anticipated, and each interaction recorded in the growing mental archive that would serve as the blueprint for future strategies. The lessons of the first age, combined with the unique opportunities of the second, crystallized in Myron's approach. Mastery lay in shaping the unseen, in guiding thought and perception, and in leveraging symbols, knowledge, and reputation to extend influence beyond immediate presence. He understood that the exercise of overt power was transient, while the shaping of desire, loyalty, and expectation endured. The forging of artifacts, the strategic guidance of leaders, and the cultivation of knowledge became instruments of a patient, enduring dominion, preparing him for the epochal events that would follow. By the close of this period, Myron had transformed his understanding of influence from abstract observation to applied mastery. He had learned to anticipate consequence, shape perception, and guide ambition with precision. The cultivation of Numenor's potential, the mentoring of its leaders, and the subtle orchestration of cultural and political development provided both practice and precedent for the methods he would later employ across Middle-earth. He had refined patience, discretion, and foresight into a single, coherent approach to power, capable of enduring across centuries and transcending the limitations of direct intervention. The Second Age, still young and full of possibility, now carried the quiet imprints of Myron's influence. He remained a shadow, a subtle guide, and a patient observer, shaping outcomes, mentoring ambition, and extending his reach without revealing presence. Yet even in this hidden mastery, the foundations of the One Ring and the instruments of future dominion were taking shape, their potential seeded in the subtle lessons of mentorship, observation, and calculated intervention. The next chapter will follow Myron as he moves from quiet guidance to active construction as he collaborates with the greatest elven smiths in Eregion, laying the groundwork for the forging of the rings of power. We will witness the synthesis of intellect, ambition, and subtle influence into tangible artifacts capable of extending will and authority, marking the transformation of Myron into Sauron, a figure whose shadow will endure across all ages of Middle-earth. The land of Eregion, nestled in the western reaches of Middle-earth, shone with potential, its hills and rivers carrying the promise of artistry, craft, and ambition. It was here that Myron, now moving with purposeful intent, sought to engage directly with the mortals whose skill could transform influence into lasting instruments of power. The elven smiths, guided by vision and patience, labored with a precision and creativity that echoed the music of the Ainur themselves, and Myron observed them with the quiet scrutiny of a mind accustomed to discerning potential and shaping consequence. Here, the mechanics of persuasion and guidance converged with craft, and he began to translate the abstract mastery of influence into tangible artifacts capable of extending will across distance and time. Myron's approach was deliberate, subtle, and framed as counsel rather than command. He presented himself as a teacher, a source of wisdom and insight, carefully gauging temperament, ambition, and curiosity in equal measure. The elves, proud yet receptive to knowledge, were drawn to his intellect, unaware that behind every suggestion lay layers of strategy, foresight, and anticipation. He guided their hands in the forging of alloys, the shaping of metals, and the imbuing of intent within crafted objects, all while observing the unfolding effects on both perception and behavior. In this delicate interplay of guidance and creation, Myron refined the techniques that would later define his dominion: the alignment of will, skill, and material to extend influence beyond immediate presence, and the careful orchestration of desire and expectation to secure enduring loyalty. The process of creation was as much psychological as it was physical. Myron studied how symbols could shape allegiance, how beauty and perfection could inspire devotion, and how subtle demonstration of skill could reinforce authority. Each ring, each artifact, became a vessel, not only of craftsmanship, but of intent, capable of guiding thought, expectation, and desire. He encouraged the smiths to explore subtle variations in design, to experiment with the interplay of light and metal, and to consider the resonance of form with purpose. Through this patient guidance, he ensured that each creation would not merely serve immediate utility, but would endure as a conduit of influence, shaping action and perception long after the smith's hands had left the workbench. It was in the quiet study of consequence that Myron's mastery became most apparent. He anticipated the reactions of those who would receive these creations, calculated the subtle shifts in allegiance and ambition that might follow, and ensured that each artifact was aligned with the broader currents of influence he sought to cultivate. He noted how desire could be cultivated through perception, how loyalty could be inspired by perceived authority, and how the interplay of fear and hope could guide decision-making without overt coercion. Each act of guidance was measured, each suggestion weighed against potential long-term outcomes, and each intervention recorded in a mental ledger of cause and effect that would inform actions for centuries to come. In collaboration with the elven smiths, Myron began the process of forging objects of profound significance. These were not merely tools or ornaments, but vessels designed to carry intention across distance and time. He guided their understanding of alignment, resonance, and connection, ensuring that the rings would amplify skill, inspire loyalty, and subtly bind the wearers to broader patterns of influence. The lessons of the First Age and the early Second Age were applied meticulously. The careful calibration of perception, the strategic shaping of ambition, and the patient anticipation of consequence. Each ring became a nexus of intellect, desire, and artistry, a tangible manifestation of Myron's mastery, capable of extending influence in ways that far exceeded his immediate presence. Yet even as the work progressed, Myron remained acutely aware of the inherent risks. The forging of objects with the potential to guide thought and intention carried both opportunity and danger. Misjudged influence could provoke resistance, and the projection of will beyond immediate control could yield unforeseen consequences. He observed the interplay of ambition and desire in the smiths themselves, guiding their understanding of purpose and restraint, and ensuring that their work remained aligned with broader objectives, without revealing the full scope of his intent. In these measures, he refined the balance between concealment and guidance, crafting an approach that would allow influence to endure long after the architect's presence had vanished. The process was not solely technical, it was also deeply relational. Myron cultivated trust, demonstrating insight, patience, and knowledge that inspired confidence. He framed instruction as collaboration, allowing the smiths to feel ownership and agency, while subtly directing their choices toward predetermined outcomes. He observed their responses with meticulous attention, noting tendencies toward pride, ambition, and caution, and used these observations to refine both approach and design. In doing so, he learned to manipulate the delicate interplay of perception, expectation, and intention, ensuring that guidance was both effective and enduring. Each interaction became a study in influence, each suggestion a rehearsal in the orchestration of consequence, and each observation a step in the evolution of mastery. As the rings took form, Myron began to embed within them principles that would later define his enduring strategy: the channeling of skill, the amplification of loyalty, and the quiet extension of authority. He understood that power exercised subtly could endure far beyond the reach of armies, fortresses, or immediate command. The rings were instruments not merely of utility, but of alignment, capable of guiding the ambitions and actions of those who wore them, while maintaining the appearance of independent choice. In these early creations, he perfected the synthesis of intellect, craft, and subtle persuasion, achieving a level of mastery that would resonate across generations. The moral weight of this endeavor was never absent from his calculations. Each act of guidance, each subtle manipulation, carried potential consequence. He considered the long-term effects on elven culture, the balance of ambition, and the ethical implications of shaping will without consent. These considerations were integrated into every step, ensuring that influence was exercised with precision, restraint, and foresight. Myron recognized that the exercise of power, even in its most subtle form, could ripple outward, altering destinies in ways that would not be immediately apparent. His discipline, patience, and meticulous calculation allowed him to navigate these complexities, transforming potential risk into enduring mastery. By the time the forging was complete, Myron had achieved a remarkable synthesis of skill, intellect, and foresight. The rings were more than objects. They were vessels of influence, instruments of alignment, and extensions of will. Through them, he could subtly shape desire, inspire loyalty, and guide the ambitions of others without revealing his hand. The lessons of the First Age, the careful cultivation of influence in Numenor, and the patient guidance of elven craftsmanship had converged to produce an unprecedented mechanism for extending authority across distance and time. In these creations, Myron's mastery of consequence, subtlety, and foresight reached a new apex, preparing the path for his transformation into Sauron, the Dark Lord whose shadow would endure through all ages. Even as the work concluded, Myron's mind remained attentive to the delicate balance of secrecy and influence. The distribution of these rings, the alignment of their recipients, and the cultivation of perception would require precision, patience, and continual observation. He noted the vulnerabilities inherent in ambition, the potential for pride to disrupt loyalty, and the subtle interplay of hope and fear that would guide behavior. Each decision regarding the rings was calculated to maximize long-term influence while minimizing the risk of detection or disruption, ensuring that the seeds of authority, once planted, would grow quietly yet irresistibly. The Second Age thus entered a new phase, shaped by the convergence of intellect, artistry, and subtle power. Myron's interventions in Eregion had transformed not only the material landscape of Middle-earth, but also the psychological and social dynamics that would endure for centuries. The lessons of the First Age, refined through patient observation and subtle guidance, had culminated in tangible instruments capable of extending influence beyond immediate perception. In these years, he solidified the principles that would define his enduring legacy. The integration of intellect, foresight, and subtle manipulation, the careful calibration of ambition and loyalty, and the disciplined exercise of power through both material and psychological means. As the forging of the rings of power concluded, Myron stood poised at the threshold of a transformation both profound and inevitable. The stage was set for the next era of engagement, where the lessons of observation, strategy, and subtle influence would converge with ambition, desire, and the complex dynamics of mortal and immortal ambition. The tools were in place, the principles refined, and the possibilities vast. Yet the true test of mastery would emerge only through the careful orchestration of distribution, alliance, and the cultivation of perception. The narrative of influence, consequence, and ambition would unfold across generations, and in these formative actions, the foundations of Sauron's enduring shadow were established. The next chapter will follow Myron as he steps from subtle guidance into deliberate orchestration, distributing the rings of power, negotiating alliances, and manipulating the ambitions of both elves and men. We will witness the emergence of his persona as Sauron, the extension of will through artifacts, and the quiet shaping of Middle-earth's future through strategy, intellect, and the careful calibration of consequence. The distribution of the rings of power marked the first deliberate exercise of Myron's philosophy on a grand scale, transforming abstract mastery into tangible influence that would ripple across the lands. Each ring, carefully calibrated for its intended bearer, became both a conduit of skill and a subtle instrument of control, a fusion of artistry, ambition, and foresight. Myron approached the act of gifting with precision, mindful of timing, temperament, and perception. The elves received their rings with admiration, unaware that even in their hands, these artifacts carried threads that reached back to him, invisible yet potent, shaping thought, desire, and expectation in ways that would endure beyond any immediate observation. This orchestration demanded patience, subtlety, and a profound understanding of the psychology of power, qualities Myron had cultivated across the First and early Second Ages. He began with the leaders of Eregion, whose craftsmanship and ambition were tempered by curiosity and a desire for knowledge. The rings he provided enhanced their skill, deepened their insight, and elevated their capacity for creation. Yet, beneath the gifts lay a quiet tether, a channel through which his will could extend without overt command. Myron observed their responses with meticulous attention, noting the interplay of pride, ambition, and cautious respect. Each moment was a study in subtle manipulation, how an individual's confidence could be amplified without arrogance, how desire for achievement could be guided without resentment, and how the perception of independence could coexist with the quiet shaping of outcome. Through this careful orchestration, he ensured that influence was exercised with maximal effect and minimal risk of disruption. Beyond Eregion, Myron turned his attention to the broader dynamics of Middle-earth. The rings of power were instruments, not only of craft, but of alignment, capable of binding loyalty, inspiring collaboration, and extending authority across the lands. He anticipated how their presence would alter the interactions of elves, the ambitions of men, and the emerging tensions among mortal and immortal realms. By carefully choosing who would receive each ring, he created a lattice of influence, a network of subtle control that relied not on overt dominance, but on the quiet calibration of desire and expectation. The consequences of this distribution were immediate, yet imperceptible. Behaviors shifted, alliances reoriented, and ambitions were redirected along channels that Myron had subtly prepared. In distributing the rings to mortal leaders, particularly those of Numenor, Myron exercised both calculation and foresight. He studied the long-lived kings and ambitious nobles, anticipating how their temperaments would interact with the power of the rings. Each gift was framed as honor, guidance, or recognition, yet it contained within it the capacity to shape thought and will. He observed the interplay of pride and responsibility, the tension between desire and duty, and the subtle emergence of loyalty shaped through admiration and perceived authority. In these interactions, Myron honed his methods of influence, reinforcing the principle that power extended most enduringly through the careful alignment of perception, expectation, and desire, rather than through force. The orchestration of alliances and perception extended beyond individual recipients. Myron considered the broader consequences of gifting, how the presence of the rings would alter cultural hierarchies, shift priorities, and influence the strategies of those not yet directly engaged. He anticipated rivalries, collaborations, and the subtle forms of competition that would emerge, ensuring that each development served the broader lattice of influence he was constructing. Through these calculations, he transformed what might have been isolated gifts into instruments capable of shaping civilizations, extending the reach of his will across generations and reinforcing his emerging identity as Sauron, a figure of intellect, foresight, and subtle power. As the effects of the rings began to manifest, Myron observed the delicate balance of consequence and perception. Elves, inspired by their enhanced skill, pursued feats of creation and innovation, deepening the cultural richness of their realms, while unknowingly aligning their actions with his broader design. Mortal leaders, emboldened by the power granted to them, sought dominion, prestige, and recognition. Their ambitions guided subtly toward outcomes Myron had anticipated and prepared for. In each instance, the rings functioned as both tools and conduits, amplifying skill, shaping desire, and extending authority while maintaining the illusion of independence. The interplay of freedom and influence became a defining feature of his strategy, demonstrating the enduring power of subtle manipulation over overt control. Myron's careful observation extended to the psychological consequences of these gifts. He noted the emergence of pride, the quiet struggle to balance ambition with duty, and the subtle tensions that arose as recipients recognized both the benefits and the responsibilities conferred by the rings. He anticipated that these tensions would shape behavior, create dependencies, and generate loyalties aligned with his overarching design. Through patient attention, he ensured that the long-term effects of distribution would reinforce the stability of his influence, establishing patterns that would persist even in the absence of direct guidance. The orchestration of consequence, perception, and desire became both art and science, an intricate system that would define his methods for centuries. In parallel, Myron refined his understanding of concealment and the exercise of unseen influence. He recognized that the effectiveness of the rings relied not only on their inherent properties, but on the perception of independence and autonomy. To maintain this perception, he moderated his interactions, allowing initiative to appear self-directed while guiding outcomes from behind the veil of subtle suggestion. He observed how expectation and belief could be shaped, how trust could be cultivated, and how authority could be exercised indirectly through symbols and artifacts. Each observation informed subsequent interventions, reinforcing the principle that enduring influence relied upon invisibility, patience, and the careful orchestration of perception. The process of embedding authority within the rings also involved the calibration of risk. Myron anticipated that ambition, pride, and desire, if unmoderated, could destabilize both the recipients and the broader network of influence. He incorporated mechanisms of subtle alignment, psychological reinforcement, and expectation management, ensuring that each recipient remained connected to the broader lattice of influence without perceiving compulsion. In this way, he transformed potential vulnerability into a mechanism of control, converting the unpredictable dynamics of ambition and desire into predictable channels of action. Each decision, each placement, and each subtle calibration became part of an intricate system designed to extend will across both space and time. Through these exercises, Myron solidified the principles that would define his enduring persona as Sauron. The mastery of consequence, the patient orchestration of influence, and the integration of intellect, psychology, and material craft into a cohesive strategy. The rings were more than instruments. They were extensions of his will, conduits through which thought, desire, and loyalty could be guided without overt presence. By observing responses, calibrating interventions, and anticipating long-term outcomes, he ensured that his influence would persist across generations, shaping both the behavior of individuals and the trajectory of civilizations. Yet even as the rings empowered their bearers, Myron remained vigilant of the moral and strategic weight of his actions. He reflected upon the responsibilities inherent in shaping desire, guiding ambition, and manipulating perception. Each decision carried consequence, each intervention carried risk, and each act of influence required foresight and restraint. He measured the outcomes carefully, noting both immediate effects and the subtle ripples that would emerge over time. This discipline, cultivated over centuries, allowed him to navigate the complex interplay of power, perception, and morality, ensuring that his designs remained both effective and enduring. By the conclusion of this distribution, Myron's transformation from subtle guide to orchestrator of influence was complete. The rings of power were in place, each a nexus of skill, authority, and psychological alignment, extending his will across the lands and generations. The intricate web of influence, anticipation, and subtle manipulation was established, linking mortal and immortal ambition to a single, coherent strategy. In these acts, the principles of intellect, foresight, and consequence, honed through centuries of observation and intervention, achieved full expression, marking the emergence of Sauron, a presence whose shadow would endure across Middle-earth for ages to come. The next chapter will follow the consequences of the ring's distribution, exploring how Myron consolidates influence, manipulates emerging rivalries, and encounters resistance. We will witness the subtle escalation of ambition, the interplay of trust and suspicion among bearers, and the gradual emergence of the Dark Lord's persona, whose intellect, foresight, and disciplined orchestration of consequence will set the stage for the great conflicts of the Second Age. The rings of power, now distributed among elves and men, began to shape the currents of Middle-earth in ways subtle yet profound, and Myron, ever vigilant, observed the unfolding consequences with meticulous care. The elves, gifted with heightened skill and wisdom, deepened their craftsmanship and extended the scope of their realms, unaware that even their creativity now flowed along channels subtly guided by his intent. Mortal leaders, emboldened by newfound authority, pursued ambitions both noble and precarious, their desires quietly tethered to the lattice of influence Myron had established. The interplay of pride, loyalty, and expectation created patterns that were both predictable and resilient, demonstrating the enduring efficacy of subtle orchestration over overt dominion. He watched these threads converge, noting which ambitions aligned naturally and which required intervention, and he prepared to adjust with precision when the time demanded. Myron's attentions turned to the latent tensions emerging among ring-bearers. Ambition, when mingled with skill and longevity, had a way of producing friction, even among the most loyal. He observed rivalries that were, on the surface, ordinary disputes over territory or recognition, yet underneath, they revealed opportunities to guide perception and channel ambition. By selectively reinforcing or withholding counsel, Myron shaped responses, allowing disputes to simmer or resolve as needed to serve long-term outcomes. The subtle manipulation of rivalry became a mechanism for both control and insight. Those who sought power too aggressively revealed character, while those who deferred or observed demonstrated adaptability and reliability. Through this quiet orchestration, he extended influence not merely through gifts, but through the dynamics of interaction themselves. In Numenor, the effects were equally intricate. Mortal kings, emboldened by the authority conferred through the rings, pursued expansion, maritime exploration, and cultural refinement. Yet each act carried a latent alignment with Myron's larger design. He noted the delicate balance between pride and obedience, ambition and foresight, and subtly guided decisions through counsel, prophecy, and suggestion, never appearing as a force to be resisted or overtly challenged. Through patient observation and intervention, he ensured that loyalty and ambition were aligned, while still preserving the perception of independence. Every negotiation, every recommendation, every hint of guidance served to strengthen the lattice of influence, preparing the foundation for a broader dominion that would span continents and generations. The strategic orchestration of perception extended to the forging of alliances. Myron recognized that loyalty was reinforced not only through the enhancement of skill or authority, but through the careful calibration of interdependence. By encouraging collaboration, cultivating mutual respect, and subtly highlighting shared ambition, he created networks of cooperation that extended his influence beyond individual recipients. Each interaction was measured. The perception of equality encouraged initiative, while subtle guidance ensured alignment with broader objectives. Rivalries, when anticipated and shaped, became tools rather than threats, reinforcing loyalty while demonstrating the consequences of unchecked pride. In this manner, he transformed social and political dynamics into instruments of subtle control, extending authority through influence rather than compulsion. Even as these structures solidified, Myron remained attentive to the latent risks. pride, suspicion, and unforeseen desire had the potential to destabilize the carefully constructed lattice of influence. He monitored the reactions of elves and men alike, noting emerging patterns, potential fractures, and unanticipated consequences. When friction threatened coherence, he intervened with discretion, shaping dialogue, highlighting precedent, or offering counsel that redirected ambition along channels aligned with his designs. In these quiet interventions, he demonstrated a mastery of consequence, the ability to guide without imposing, to anticipate disruption before it unfolded, and to transform potential threat into reinforcing mechanism. The calculus of influence, once theoretical, had now been applied with precision across the living dynamics of societies. The moral and philosophical dimensions of his work were not neglected. Myron remained conscious that shaping the will of others carried weight, and that long-term stability required not only technical mastery, but the careful calibration of consequence. Each act of guidance or subtle manipulation was measured against potential outcomes, ensuring that ambition and desire, once channeled, would reinforce stability rather than provoke rebellion. He observed the psychological patterns of mortals and immortals alike, noting tendencies toward pride, curiosity, and caution, and integrated these observations into every action. The rings of power, while instruments of influence, were also tests of perception, loyalty, and restraint, and he measured the success of his designs by both immediate effect and enduring stability. Myron's work extended to the subtleties of trust and dependence. He observed how confidence in one's skill or authority could be reinforced through recognition, guidance, and validation, creating a quiet dependency on perception rather than coercion. This subtle dependence allowed him to extend influence across time and distance, ensuring that decisions aligned with broader objectives even in his absence. The elves, unaware of the underlying tether, relied on their own insight, creativity, and judgment. Yet their ambitions were subtly guided, their actions aligned with outcomes he had anticipated and prepared. In this quiet symbiosis, Myron demonstrated the enduring potency of indirect control, crafting systems that relied on perception, expectation, and subtle alignment rather than overt domination. In the shaping of Numenor's trajectory, he recognized the importance of narrative as a tool of influence. Prophecies, counsel, and historical precedent were woven into the perception of destiny, creating a framework through which ambition and loyalty could be guided without explicit imposition. The kings and nobles internalized these frameworks, aligning their actions with perceived inevitability, while remaining unaware of the guiding hand behind them. Myron observed this interplay with meticulous attention, adjusting guidance to account for emerging ambition, tempering pride with recognition, and ensuring that perception reinforced stability. In these exercises, the combination of intellect, foresight, and subtle manipulation achieved its most refined expression, transforming entire societies into instruments of enduring influence. The latent tensions among ring-bearers also became opportunities for learning. By observing rivalries and conflicts, Myron discerned character, ambition, and adaptability. Those who reacted with measured restraint revealed reliability. Those consumed by pride exposed vulnerabilities, and those who aligned ambition with shared objectives became allies in the subtle orchestration of power. Each interaction served as a data point in a vast mental ledger, informing future guidance, reinforcing loyalty, and refining the alignment of perception and expectation. Through patient observation, he transformed emergent behavior into a mechanism of enduring influence, ensuring that both success and failure contributed to the stability of his overarching design. Even as he manipulated perception and ambition, Myron refined the art of concealment. The effectiveness of the rings relied upon the belief in autonomy, the perception that skill and achievement were unbound by external guidance. He moderated his interventions to maintain this perception, allowing initiative to appear self-directed, while subtly guiding outcomes in alignment with his design. Through this careful calibration, influence was exercised without overt imposition, reinforcing both the effectiveness of the rings and the resilience of the system he had constructed. The orchestration of consequence, perception, and desire became both art and science, a mechanism that extended authority across time, space, and consciousness without direct force. The exercise of influence through rivalry and alliance also illuminated the mechanisms of loyalty. Myron noted that cooperation could be reinforced not merely through reward, but through shared aspiration, mutual recognition, and the perception of aligned destiny. By cultivating these dynamics, he created networks of interdependence that strengthened his control without overt imposition. Rivalry, when guided, could enhance respect and initiative. Tension, when anticipated, could clarify priorities and reinforce cohesion. Each adjustment, subtle yet deliberate, ensured that the lattice of influence remained both resilient and adaptive, capable of absorbing disruption while maintaining coherence. By the close of this phase, Myron's orchestration of the rings had achieved full effect. Influence, loyalty, and ambition were aligned across multiple societies, guided through perception, expectation, and subtle intervention. The elves advanced their skill, mortals pursued ambition with calibrated restraint, and the lattice of influence extended across lands and generations, resilient and largely imperceptible. In these actions, the principles of intellect, foresight, and consequence had converged, producing a system of enduring power that would form the foundation of Sauron's identity. A master of subtle control, patient orchestration, and long-term design. The next chapter will explore the rise of resistance, the emergence of the Noldorin awareness of external manipulation, and the subtle clash between ambition and foresight. We will follow Myron as he navigates these early frictions, tests the limits of loyalty, and further refines his orchestration of influence, setting the stage for the enduring conflicts that will define the remainder of the Second Age. Even as the rings of power exerted their subtle influence across Middle-earth, the Noldorin elves began to sense a disturbance, a quiet imperfection in the harmony of their creations. Their heightened perception, born of long-lived observation and an innate attunement to craft and intention, allowed them to detect anomalies, patterns that suggested external guidance. It was not an accusation, nor a clear perception of the architect behind these patterns, but a whisper of unease, a shadow against the perfection of their design. Myron observed their subtle awareness with patience, noting which minds were sensitive to irregularity, which would question but not act, and which might resist entirely. The early signs of resistance were faint, yet they marked a crucial point in the evolution of his orchestration. Influence, no matter how subtle, could provoke the stirrings of scrutiny and the emergence of independent perception. The first moments of suspicion were almost imperceptible. Among the greatest smiths, questions arose about the alignment of skill and ambition, the seeming synchronicity of decisions, and the unexpected perfection of certain artifacts. These observations, while not directed or accusatory, created a tension that demanded careful management. Myron responded not through confrontation, but through further subtle guidance. He offered explanations framed in terms of collective insight or serendipitous inspiration, reinforcing the perception of autonomy while gently steering awareness away from the source. Each response was measured, ensuring that curiosity was engaged but redirected, and that the underlying lattice of influence remained unexposed. In Numenor, too, signs of resistance began to emerge. Mortal leaders, emboldened by the power of the rings, occasionally chafed against the constraints of expectation or tradition. Ambition collided with perceived autonomy, and subtle rivalries tested the alignment Myron had established. He observed these tensions with keen attention, recognizing both threat and opportunity. Through carefully crafted counsel, the subtle presentation of precedent, and the reinforcement of cultural aspiration, he guided responses, ensuring that ambition was expressed in ways that strengthened the broader lattice of influence rather than undermining it. The delicate balance between empowerment and guidance became central to his strategy, demanding both foresight and subtlety in equal measure. The emergence of these early frictions revealed the limits of influence and the necessity of adaptability. Myron understood that even the most carefully orchestrated systems required adjustment when met with unanticipated perception. He monitored interactions, tested responses, and refined guidance, ensuring that loyalty and ambition remained aligned while preserving the illusion of independence. In these exercises, he cultivated resilience in both his strategy and his agents. Those who adapted to subtle guidance became allies in the orchestration of influence, while those resistant or reckless were observed, assessed, and, when necessary, redirected. Through this patient calibration, he transformed resistance from a threat into a mechanism of learning and reinforcement, deepening the sophistication of his control. The lessons of these early resistances were manifold. Myron observed that perception was malleable, but not infinitely so. That curiosity, once aroused, required engagement, and that ambition, if unchecked, could destabilize even the most meticulously constructed system. He refined methods of subtle distraction, the strategic introduction of doubt, and the careful reinforcement of belief to guide thought and action without coercion. Each intervention was crafted to preserve perception of autonomy, while ensuring outcomes aligned with broader objectives. Through these techniques, he integrated resistance into the system itself, using it as a source of insight, adjustment, and reinforcement, rather than a disruption. Among the elves, the most perceptive began to hypothesize about external guidance. They noted patterns in timing, alignment of skill, and convergence of decision-making that suggested influence beyond the scope of mortal or elven intention. Myron observed these inklings with interest, recognizing both the sophistication of their insight and the necessity of careful intervention. He introduced new challenges, subtle variations, and alternative explanations that engaged curiosity while redirecting scrutiny. By framing perception as collaborative insight rather than confrontation, he preserved loyalty and alignment while deepening the intellectual engagement of his agents, ensuring that the lattice of influence remained coherent even under observation. Myron also noted the interplay between trust and suspicion. The perception of guidance, once detected, had the potential to either reinforce loyalty or provoke skepticism. He carefully calibrated interactions to maintain confidence, providing counsel in ways that emphasized mutual respect and shared aspiration. He reinforced the perception of independent achievement while gently guiding decisions along predetermined channels. In doing so, he transformed the potential threat of suspicion into a mechanism of subtle reinforcement, ensuring that even the most perceptive individuals contributed to the stability of his influence rather than undermining it. The challenges of resistance illuminated the necessity of layered influence. Myron realized that direct guidance, artifact-based influence, and cultural shaping needed to operate in parallel, reinforcing each other to ensure resilience. By embedding alignment in multiple channels, skill, ambition, perception, and cultural aspiration, he created a system capable of absorbing scrutiny while maintaining coherence. Resistance, once a source of disruption, became a form of feedback, informing adjustments, highlighting vulnerabilities, and reinforcing the adaptability of the lattice. Each interaction, each response, each subtle intervention contributed to the refinement of a system that would endure across generations. As he managed these emergent frictions, Myron also observed the early stirrings of moral and ethical consideration among his agents. Questions of intent, the proper use of power, and the balance of ambition and responsibility emerged naturally as a consequence of perception and interaction. These reflections, while subtle and often unspoken, provided opportunities for further guidance. Myron shaped the frameworks through which these questions were considered, presenting precedent, highlighting potential consequences, and reinforcing the alignment of action with broader objectives. In this way, even independent reflection and ethical deliberation were woven into the lattice of influence, extending his subtle authority while maintaining the perception of autonomy. The lessons of this period were crucial for the emergence of Sauron as both strategist and manipulator. Myron learned to anticipate scrutiny, manage perception, and integrate resistance into the mechanisms of control. He recognized that loyalty and influence were strengthened not by suppression, but by careful engagement, that perception of freedom could coexist with alignment, and that the orchestration of consequence demanded both patience and precision. These insights would inform every subsequent action, shaping the principles through which power would be exercised for centuries to come. By the close of this chapter, the lattice of influence had been tested, refined, and strengthened. Subtle suspicion had emerged, ambition had been channeled, and loyalty had been reinforced through perception, guidance, and strategic engagement. Myron's mastery of indirect control, patient orchestration, and the integration of intellect and foresight reached a new level of sophistication, establishing the foundation for his full transformation into Sauron. The early stirrings of resistance, rather than undermining his design, had become a tool, a mechanism through which perception, ambition, and desire could be aligned with long-term objectives. The next chapter will follow Myron as he confronts the first open challenges to his orchestration navigating both subtle rebellion and the rising awareness of the elves. We will witness the interplay of trust, ambition, and strategy as Sauron begins to assert a more deliberate presence, testing the resilience of his influence and exploring the consequences of emerging opposition while refining the principles that will define his shadow across the Second Age. The first deliberate challenges to Myron's orchestration arose not through overt rebellion, but through subtle defiance, misalignment of ambition, and the cautious assertion of independence. Among the Noldoran smiths of Eregion, whispers began to circulate regarding the convergence of skill and insight, patterns that suggested guidance beyond mere collaboration. The most perceptive among them noted the uncanny consistency of outcomes, the alignment of decisions across distant regions, and the improbable perfection of certain artifacts. These observations, shared in quiet conversation and careful deliberation, formed the earliest nucleus of active scrutiny. Myron, now fully embracing his identity as Sauron, observed this emergence with composed attention, recognizing both the risk and the opportunity inherent in nascent awareness. He approached these challenges not with confrontation, but with precision. Subtle engagement, calibrated counsel, and the strategic reinforcement of confidence were employed to redirect curiosity while preserving loyalty. Sauron recognized that forceful correction would provoke resistance, whereas measured guidance could transform scrutiny into a mechanism of reinforcement. He offered insight framed as collaboration, highlighted precedent as if discovered independently by his interlocutors, and allowed their sense of agency to remain intact, all while maintaining the broader alignment of action with his designs. Each response was crafted to preserve perception, extend influence, and prevent fractures from emerging in the lattice of loyalty. In Numenor, the emergence of subtle dissent presented a parallel challenge. Mortal kings, emboldened by the rings, occasionally pressed against the boundaries of counsel and tradition, seeking autonomy in ways that risked misalignment with Sauron's strategic lattice. Ambition, once tempered by guidance, now sought expression beyond the channels he had prepared. He observed the tension with careful anticipation, noting which leaders were prone to independent initiative, which could be aligned through recognition or counsel, and which required subtle redirection. By integrating these insights into the distribution of guidance and influence, Sauron ensured that ambition was exercised in ways that reinforced broader objectives rather than undermining them. The orchestration of perception became increasingly intricate. Sauron recognized that influence was most durable when autonomy appeared unimpeded, when initiative was perceived as self-directed, and when insight seemed arrived at independently. He refined techniques of engagement, introducing subtle variations, alternative interpretations, and calibrated challenges to sustain attention while guiding outcome. Suspicion, curiosity, and independent reflection were transformed into instruments of alignment, woven seamlessly into the broader lattice of influence. By managing perception and consequence simultaneously, Sauron demonstrated a mastery of indirect control, extending authority across space, time, and consciousness without overt domination. The dynamics of trust and interdependence were equally central. Rivalries, when anticipated, could reinforce cohesion if skillfully guided. Tensions could clarify priorities, reveal character, and strengthen alignment if left to unfold within carefully structured constraints. Sauron cultivated these dynamics, ensuring that the exercise of power, ambition, and desire contributed to the stability of the lattice rather than fracturing it. Each interaction, each subtle intervention, became both a test and a reinforcement of loyalty, skill, and perception, creating a self-sustaining network of influence whose resilience extended far beyond immediate observation. In the midst of these challenges, Sauron began to expand the practical applications of the rings themselves. Beyond the enhancement of skill or authority, they became instruments for observing behavior, testing response to temptation, and calibrating the exercise of autonomy. He noted patterns of ambition, the emergence of curiosity, and the subtle consequences of envy or rivalry, integrating these insights into subsequent guidance. Each artifact functioned not only as a tool of empowerment, but as a conduit for perception, providing real-time insight into character, intent, and potential deviation. In this way, the rings became both instruments of influence and instruments of intelligence, extending his awareness and control simultaneously. The emergence of overt perception also demanded subtle measures of defense. Sauron recognized that awareness could lead to challenge if left unchecked, and he prepared multiple layers of response. Diversion through collaboration, reinforcement through recognition, and redirection through reinterpretation of insight. He allowed scrutiny to exist without appearing threatened, managing the balance of suspicions and confidence to maintain cohesion. In this process, the lattice of influence was reinforced rather than weakened. Each challenge became a mechanism for adaptation, refinement, and resilience. The perception of threat, if managed with skill, could serve as a catalyst for further alignment. Sauron's engagement with resistance revealed the nuanced interplay between pride, ambition, and perception. Individuals who recognized patterns or anomalies were tempted to assert autonomy, yet their own desires could be channeled through subtle reinforcement, validation, and redirection. By allowing initiative to appear self-directed while guiding outcomes toward alignment, Sauron transformed potential friction into an instrument of control. Ambition, rather than threatening coherence, became a reinforcing force. Curiosity, rather than undermining authority, became a tool for calibration. And independence, rather than fracturing loyalty, became a means of deepening engagement with the lattice. Through this careful orchestration, Sauron refined the principles that would define his enduring influence. The balance between visibility and concealment, autonomy and guidance, desire and expectation became central to his strategy. He observed, measured, and calibrated, ensuring that each interaction contributed to long-term stability while preserving the perception of independence. Resistance, scrutiny, and the assertion of autonomy were transformed into mechanisms for insight, adaptation, and reinforcement, demonstrating the sophistication of indirect control and the enduring efficacy of patient orchestration over overt coercion. The ethical dimensions of these interactions were never absent from consideration. Sauron measured the consequences of subtle manipulation against long-term objectives, ensuring that guidance aligned with both stability and the preservation of loyalty. The exercise of influence, though invisible, carried weight, and he navigated the delicate balance between persuasion and compulsion, observation and intervention with precision. By integrating perception, ambition, and consequence into a coherent system, he established a framework in which power was exercised indirectly, yet with enduring effect, extending across individuals, societies, and generations. The subtle management of friction also revealed the latent potential for collaboration. Rivalries, ambition, and scrutiny could be transformed into alignment, mutual reinforcement, and engagement through carefully calibrated guidance. Sauron encouraged exploration within constraints, provided insight framed as discovery, and allowed initiative to flourish, while maintaining coherence with broader objectives. In this way, even challenges to authority were absorbed into the lattice, contributing to resilience rather than disruption. Each interaction, whether tension or cooperation, became a node in an intricate network, reinforcing stability and extending influence simultaneously. As these processes matured, Sauron began to recognize the emerging contours of his full identity. No longer merely a subtle guide, he now operated as both strategist and manipulator, exercising foresight, intellect, and patience to orchestrate outcomes across civilizations. The rings of power were instruments, conduits, and sensors, extending authority while preserving perception of independence. Observation, intervention, and calibration became continuous, integrated processes transforming suspicion, ambition, and curiosity into mechanisms of alignment and reinforcement. In these operations, Sauron demonstrated mastery of indirect control, achieving influence that was both enduring and invisible, and laying the groundwork for the conflicts and dynamics that would define the remainder of the Second Age. By the close of this chapter, the lattice of influence had been tested through subtle challenge, scrutiny, and the assertion of independent ambition. Sauron's interventions, measured and deliberate, preserved alignment, extended loyalty, and transformed resistance into a mechanism of refinement. The principles of indirect control, patient orchestration, and integration of perception, ambition, and consequence had matured to a level of sophistication that would endure for centuries. In these interactions, he demonstrated that authority need not be overt to be effective, that influence could persist through perception and subtle guidance, and that the orchestration of consequence could be both subtle and enduring. The next chapter will explore the escalation of tension as Sauron faces the first coordinated awareness among the elves, the subtle cracks forming in Numenor's alignment, and the strategies he employs to consolidate influence while navigating emerging opposition. We will witness the gradual emergence of his persona as the Dark Lord, fully attuned to the interplay of loyalty, ambition, and the orchestration of long-term consequence, preparing the stage for the conflicts that will define the age. By the time the first coordinated awareness among the elves began to emerge, Sauron had already integrated decades of observation, subtle intervention, and calculated influence into a coherent strategy. The elves' perceptions had sharpened, guided by centuries of skill, insight, and reflective thought. And now they began to recognize patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. They compared artifacts, discussed methods, and shared insights across regions, slowly forming a lattice of understanding that, while incomplete, suggested an unseen hand orchestrating outcomes beyond their immediate control. Sauron watched the formation of this emergent scrutiny with calm attention, perceiving it not solely as threat, but as a new dimension through which the resilience and adaptability of his influence could be tested and strengthened. He understood that perception, once coordinated, required careful engagement. Direct confrontation would provoke resistance. Overt displays of power would fracture loyalty. Instead, he employed measures that were subtle, almost imperceptible. Guiding discussions with carefully chosen observations, suggesting alternative interpretations, and framing insights as discoveries made collectively by the elves themselves. In doing so, he preserved their sense of autonomy while subtly channeling conclusions along paths that reinforced the lattice of influence. Every carefully crafted suggestion, every implied principle, and every acknowledged precedent was an instrument of alignment, ensuring that even coordinated scrutiny advanced his objectives rather than undermined them. Simultaneously, Numenor presented new challenges. Kings and nobles, influenced by the rings, began to perceive disparities between their ambition and the perceived guidance of Sauron. Some chafed against subtle constraints, asserting independence in ways that threatened misalignment with his broader design. Sauron, now fully embracing the persona of the Dark Lord, employed layered strategies of counsel, narrative framing, and selective reinforcement. By highlighting historical precedent, emphasizing collective aspiration, and subtly demonstrating consequences of divergence, he redirected ambition without overt coercion, maintaining the perception of freedom while ensuring that alignment with his long-term strategy remained intact. These efforts reinforced his understanding that influence was sustained most effectively through perception rather than domination. The orchestration of trust, rivalry, and interdependence became more sophisticated. Sauron observed that the coordinated awareness of the elves could be guided to strengthen collaboration rather than foment rebellion. He introduced opportunities for shared achievement, framed rivalry as constructive, and subtly reinforced the perception that collective skill and insight would yield the most enduring outcomes. In this manner, suspicion and curiosity were transformed into instruments of engagement, loyalty, and reinforcement. The lattice of influence, once tested by individual scrutiny, now adapted to accommodate coordinated observation, illustrating the resilience and adaptability of his approach. Within this climate of cautious scrutiny, the rings themselves continued to function as both instruments of empowerment and sensors of perception. Sauron observed how the elves' abilities and ambitions evolved in response to new challenges, noting patterns of decision-making, the interplay of pride and collaboration, and the emerging awareness of interconnection across regions. Mortal leaders in Numenor, responding to subtle constraints and opportunities, also demonstrated patterns of ambition, risk-taking, and alignment with broader objectives. By integrating these observations, Sauron refined interventions, adjusting guidance, calibrating expectation, and deepening the subtle channels of influence that had now become both pervasive and resilient. The early emergence of coordinated awareness introduced new opportunities for testing perception and loyalty. Sauron carefully structured challenges that required collaboration, analytical reflection, and disciplined judgment, observing responses without revealing the underlying orchestration. He noted who exercised measured restraint, who sought domination without discernment, and who aligned ambition with broader objectives. These observations informed subsequent interventions, allowing subtle correction, reinforcement of alignment, and the strategic nurturing of trust. In this way, the lattice of influence not only withstood scrutiny, but grew stronger, demonstrating the enduring potency of indirect control. Sauron also began to manipulate the perception of history, precedent, and consequence. By selectively highlighting achievements, framing narratives of collaboration, and subtly emphasizing the emergence of natural patterns, he guided thought and expectation without direct assertion. The elves, interpreting these cues through their own insight, perceived causality and pattern, yet remained unaware of the underlying orchestration. Mortal leaders, likewise, internalized these narratives as guiding principles, aligning ambition with perceived inevitability rather than explicit instruction. In this synthesis of perception, narrative, and consequence, Sauron achieved the subtle exercise of authority that would define his enduring strategy. Amid these developments, Sauron recognized the need to refine the moral and philosophical framing of his influence. The perception of choice, ethical deliberation, and responsibility became critical instruments in maintaining alignment. By creating opportunities for reflection, presenting historical and cultural precedents, and emphasizing the consequences of decision-making, he integrated autonomy and insight into the lattice of control. Individuals experienced the perception of independent reasoning and ethical consideration, yet their conclusions and actions remained aligned with the broader objectives he had carefully prepared. This balance of freedom and guidance became a defining feature of his strategic approach. The interplay of rebellion, scrutiny, and reinforcement illuminated the mechanisms through which loyalty could be strengthened. Sauron observed that suspicion, if acknowledged and guided, reinforced trust. Curiosity, if engaged constructively, reinforced collaboration. And initiative, if channeled through subtle guidance, reinforced alignment. The lattice of influence now incorporated multiple feedback loops: observation, perception, response, and reinforcement, each contributing to resilience and adaptability. Resistance, rather than undermining authority, became an instrument for refinement, demonstrating that even coordinated scrutiny could be transformed into a mechanism of control. In parallel, Sauron's understanding of temporality deepened. He observed the long-term effects of ambition, collaboration, and perception across generations, noting how early alignment, subtle correction, and careful guidance produced enduring stability. The elves, despite coordinated awareness, remained within the channels he had prepared, their collaboration reinforcing the integrity of the lattice. Mortal leaders, tempered by precedent, counsel, and subtle reinforcement, pursued objectives that aligned with broader design while perceiving autonomy. Through careful calibration of time, consequence, and perception, Sauron ensured that influence extended far beyond immediate observation, shaping outcomes across centuries. Sauron's orchestration of coordinated awareness also revealed the importance of narrative framing. By controlling the perception of causality, emphasizing natural convergence, and highlighting the apparent independence of discovery, he guided insight without overt assertion. The elves' intellectual engagement became a mechanism for reinforcing loyalty, refining skill, and aligning ambition with broader objectives. Mortal leaders internalized patterns as natural law rather than directed outcome, ensuring that perception, desire, and action remained synchronized with long-term strategy. In this synthesis, subtle guidance, observation, and the management of perception converged into a system of influence both resilient and enduring. By the close of this chapter, Sauron's orchestration had withstood its first coordinated test. Awareness among the elves, scrutiny among mortal leaders, and the assertion of independent initiative had all been observed, guided, and integrated into the lattice of influence. The system demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and subtlety, reinforcing loyalty while preserving the perception of autonomy. Sauron had refined the balance of guidance, observation, and intervention, demonstrating mastery of indirect control and the patient orchestration of consequence. His persona as the Dark Lord had emerged fully, attuned to the complexities of ambition, loyalty, and the subtle management of perception, establishing the foundation for the conflicts and consolidation that would define the remainder of the Second Age. The next chapter will follow the escalation of opposition and the first overt conflicts, tracing the interaction of ambition, suspicion, and the emerging presence of Sauron as a decisive actor. We will witness how early resistance becomes organized, how loyalty and ambition are tested, and how Sauron responds with strategy, foresight, and the patient orchestration of consequence, advancing the narrative toward the climactic shaping of the Second Age. The tension that had long simmered beneath the surface now began to crystallize into the first overt manifestations of opposition. Among the Noldoran elves, those who had perceived patterns of external influence began to confer more openly, testing hypotheses against artifacts, decisions, and the remarkable synchronicity of distant creations. While still uncertain of the nature or origin of the guiding hand, they recognized the coherence of outcomes that could not be attributed solely to individual skill. Sauron observed these gatherings with a calm, deliberate patience, noting which minds were most insightful, which were most susceptible to redirection, and which, by temperament or pride, might resist even the most subtle guidance. The lattice of influence had been tested by coordinated awareness, yet it was now challenged by intentional scrutiny, an evolution that demanded refined engagement and heightened precision. He did not respond with immediate force or confrontation. Instead, Sauron employed subtler methods, strategic framing of questions, deliberate introduction of ambiguity, and calibrated reinforcement of perception. By guiding the discourse in ways that seemed to arise naturally from the elves' collective reasoning, he preserved the appearance of autonomy while subtly shaping the direction of investigation. Each suggestion, each counterexample, and each reinforced hypothesis was an instrument of alignment, gently steering conclusions without revealing the overarching orchestration. In this manner, resistance was transformed into an instrument for both refinement and control, demonstrating that subtle influence could endure even the first overt stirrings of scrutiny. In Numenor, the early signs of unrest began to manifest more concretely. Certain mortal leaders, their ambitions emboldened by the rings, challenged customary protocols, tested the limits of counsel, and sought avenues to expand authority independently. These acts, while modest in scale, threatened to unravel the alignment Sauron had so carefully constructed. He observed not only the actions themselves, but the underlying motivations, pride, curiosity, and the perception of opportunity. Each instance of divergence became a mechanism for testing loyalty, refining perception, and calibrating subsequent guidance. By anticipating consequence and shaping expectation, he ensured that ambition could be exercised safely within the parameters of the lattice. The orchestration of rivalry, and cooperation became increasingly sophisticated. Sauron recognized that organized scrutiny, when guided, could serve as a mechanism for strengthening cohesion and reinforcing alignment. He subtly highlighted common goals, framed divergent ambitions as complementary, and allowed the perception of independent discovery to persist. Rivalries were shaped into constructive dialogue, tensions into structured negotiation, and curiosity into disciplined inquiry. In doing so, Sauron ensured that the lattice of influence remained both resilient and adaptive, transforming nascent opposition into a conduit for reinforcement and control rather than fracture. Sauron also refined his use of the rings as instruments of both empowerment and observation. Through the distribution of the lesser rings, he monitored behavior, ambition, and response to subtle challenge. The elves' skill, once heightened by these artifacts, now revealed patterns of reasoning, preference, and susceptibility. Mortal leaders, similarly enhanced, demonstrated tendencies that could be predicted, guided, and aligned through carefully calibrated reinforcement. Each interaction, each observation, and each subtle intervention contributed to a dynamic understanding of character and consequence, allowing Sauron to anticipate friction, shape initiative, and ensure the persistence of alignment across diverse actors and generations. The first coordinated challenges revealed both the promise and the vulnerability of Sauron's system. Observation and scrutiny among the elves, combined with independent initiative among mortal leaders, introduced a degree of unpredictability. Sauron responded with multiple layers of guidance, direct counsel presented as collaborative insight, narrative framing that reinforced perceived inevitability, and the subtle manipulation of consequence to encourage desired action. By integrating these measures, he maintained cohesion, redirected initiative, and transformed potential disruption into mechanisms of reinforcement. Even overt questioning could be absorbed without fracturing the lattice, reinforcing the principle that influence was most durable when exorcised indirectly. Within this evolving landscape, Sauron refined the balance between visibility and concealment. Awareness of external orchestration had reached a level that required more deliberate management. By presenting information selectively, emphasizing natural patterns, and framing outcomes as independent discovery, he preserved perception while strengthening control. The elves and mortal leaders were encouraged to reason, explore, and deliberate, yet their conclusions and actions remained subtly aligned with his broader objectives. In this manner, he exercised authority without appearing to do so, ensuring that the lattice of influence remained resilient, even under the scrutiny of coordinated awareness. Sauron's engagement with these emergent challenges also revealed the role of ethical and philosophical reflection in maintaining loyalty. Individuals, perceiving choice and responsibility, became both instruments and beneficiaries of guidance. By providing frameworks for reflection, emphasizing precedent, and demonstrating consequences through subtle example, he integrated moral deliberation into the lattice. Leaders experienced the perception of autonomous judgment, while their actions and decisions continued to align with long-term objectives. This delicate balance of autonomy, consequence, and subtle guidance became central to the resilience and durability of Sauron's influence. The orchestration of consequence, perception, and alignment reached new levels of sophistication as Sauron observed the interplay of ambition, curiosity, and collaboration. Coordinated scrutiny no longer represented a threat, but a source of insight, testing who was adaptable, who was principled, and who was susceptible to subtle guidance. Rivalries, ethical deliberation, and independent initiative became mechanisms for reinforcement, observation, and refinement, transforming emergent opposition into instruments of control. Through patient calibration, he maintained cohesion while deepening understanding, ensuring that the lattice of influence evolved in resilience, scope, and subtlety. In Numenor, the subtleties of resistance were absorbed with similar precision. Leaders who challenged expectation were guided through counsel, precedent, and calibrated narrative. Independent initiative was allowed, yet shaped to reinforce broader objectives. Those most prone to pride or ambition were observed, assessed, and subtly redirected, while those demonstrating adaptability and insight were reinforced as allies. The orchestration of these dynamics required both foresight and discretion, balancing the exercise of autonomy with alignment to long-term strategy. Each intervention preserved perception, strengthened loyalty, and extended the reach of influence across generations. Sauron's engagement with emerging opposition emphasized the importance of narrative framing and perception management. By controlling the apparent causality of events, highlighting natural convergence, and emphasizing independent discovery, he guided thought without overt assertion. Elves perceived insight as collective reasoning. Mortals internalized patterns as cultural and historical precedent. Both remained aligned with broader strategy, unaware that their observations and decisions were subtly shaped. Through this synthesis, Sauron exercised enduring influence, ensuring that perception, initiative, and consequence operated in harmony with long-term objectives. By the close of this chapter, the lattice of influence had endured its first overt tests. Coordinated awareness among the elves, independent initiative among mortal leaders, and nascent scrutiny had all been observed, guided, and integrated into the system. Resistance was transformed into refinement, scrutiny became a source of insight, and autonomy was preserved while alignment was reinforced. Sauron's mastery of indirect control, patient orchestration, and the integration of perception, consequence, and ambition had reached a level of sophistication that would endure across generations. His identity as the Dark Lord, fully attuned to the dynamics of loyalty, opposition, and subtle guidance, had been solidified, setting the stage for the escalating conflicts and decisive actions that would define the remainder of the Second Age. The next chapter will trace the rise of overt alliances and the first true confrontations, exploring how ambition, resistance, and the perception of power coalesce into conflict. We will witness Sauron consolidating influence, testing the limits of loyalty, and preparing the mechanisms through which the eventual wars and reshaping of Middle-earth will unfold, moving inexorably toward the climactic alignment of forces that will define his dominion. The web of subtle influence, long cultivated and patiently refined, now encountered the first true convergence of opposition in form as well as in intent. Among the Noldorin elves of Eregion, whispers evolved into councils, private speculation crystallized into formalized inquiry. Artisans and scholars, drawn together by the recognition of patterns too consistent to be mere coincidence, began to deliberate with a shared purpose: to understand the unseen hand that guided the flow of craft, thought, and destiny across their lands. Their deliberations, while cautious and respectful, carried an intensity that demanded measured attention. Sauron observed each step with the precision of one accustomed to orchestration, noting not merely the questions they asked, but the rhythm, tone, and subtle interplay of their reasoning. Every utterance, hesitation, and insight provided him with data, a measure of susceptibility, and an opportunity to calibrate influence. He intervened with deliberate subtlety, framing ideas as emergent from collective insight, rather than imposed by design. When anomalies in the flow of creation were raised, he suggested alternative interpretations that acknowledged perception, yet guided conclusion. Questions that might have led to direct confrontation were gently redirected, the potential for misunderstanding dissolved by careful contextualization. The elves, unaware that their reasoning was being guided, felt their intellects engaged, their agency preserved, and their curiosity validated. In this interplay, Sauron transformed emergent scrutiny into a mechanism of reinforcement. Each question sharpened the lattice of influence while remaining itself a product of seemingly independent thought. Meanwhile, in Numenor, mortal leaders were asserting ambition with increasing subtlety and coordination. Tempted by the allure of the rings and inspired by cultural aspiration, they tested the limits of precedent and guidance. Yet even as independence emerged, Sauron's subtle orchestration extended across time, perception, and consequence. He provided counsel framed as historical reflection, emphasized the inevitability of collaborative achievement, and highlighted the alignment of ambition with enduring objectives. Each interaction reinforced cohesion, tempered initiative, and ensured that even apparent divergence contributed to the resilience of his influence. The lattice now operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Perception, action, consequence, and reinforcement coalesced into a system of enduring subtlety and strength. This era of convergence also illuminated the dynamics of trust, rivalry, and perception in more complex forms. Among the elves, individuals with complementary skills began to recognize one another, forming alliances of intellect, craft, and insight. Sauron, perceiving both the promise and the peril of such cooperation, guided interactions to strengthen collaboration without permitting revelation of the overarching orchestration. Rivalries, when they arose, were harnessed as constructive tension, highlighting disparities of skill or insight as motivation rather than confrontation, fostering refinement while preserving cohesion. In this careful management of emergent networks, opposition became both a test and a reinforcement of the lattice, illustrating that even coordinated scrutiny could serve the purpose of subtle control. The rings of power, already instruments of empowerment and observation, became increasingly central to the orchestration of this new phase. Through them, Sauron monitored behavioral patterns, ambition, and susceptibility to influence with unprecedented precision. Elves' decisions, once purely the product of skill and insight, now revealed tendencies, preferences, and vulnerabilities. Mortal leaders' ambitions, tempered and shaped by rings and counsel, provided insight into the mechanisms of desire, authority, and influence. Each artifact functioned as both extension and sensor, allowing Sauron to calibrate interventions, predict responses, and maintain the subtle balance between autonomy and alignment. Observation, perception, and consequence became inseparable in the weaving of control. The first overt gestures of defiance, though cautious, were met not with immediate retaliation, but with carefully layered strategies. Sauron introduced ambiguity, redirected inquiry, and emphasized shared objectives. Leaders and artisans were allowed to explore, question, and debate within constraints, creating a perception of independence while preserving coherence with broader strategy. By framing initiative as discovery and consequence as natural law, he transformed potential friction into instruments of observation and reinforcement. Resistance, rather than destabilizing authority, became a mechanism through which alignment was both tested and strengthened, illustrating the enduring power of indirect control. Sauron's understanding of the interplay between ambition and perception deepened further. Individuals who sensed patterns or inconsistencies were guided through narrative, precedent, and subtle suggestion to perceive alignment between personal initiative and collective purpose. Pride, curiosity, and ethical reflection were not suppressed. Rather, they were channeled into actions that reinforced the lattice of influence. Leaders exercised autonomy, artisans engaged in collective reasoning, and each acted with the perception of independent agency. Yet their choices remained intimately linked to Sauron's overarching strategy. The emergent network of awareness, once a threat, now functioned as a medium of refinement and adaptation. The orchestration of consequence, perception, and ambition became more sophisticated as Sauron observed the emergent patterns of cooperation and rivalry. Among the elves, coordinated inquiry revealed both insight and error, ambition and restraint, curiosity and caution. Mortal leaders, testing limits and exploring initiative, displayed similar patterns. Sauron guided each thread, reinforcing alignment, redirecting deviation, and integrating observation into subsequent interventions. The lattice of influence, resilient and adaptive, transformed even deliberate scrutiny into a tool of calibration, demonstrating the enduring efficacy of patient, subtle orchestration over overt force. As challenges grew, Sauron refined the perception of history and inevitability. By framing achievements as natural convergence, emphasizing precedent as discovery, and presenting consequence as aligned with ethical deliberation, he preserved the appearance of autonomy while subtly shaping understanding. Elves reasoned collectively. Mortals internalized patterns as cultural norm rather than imposed outcome. Both remained aligned with strategy, unaware that their perception, reasoning, and initiative were shaped by an unseen hand. In this integration of perception, narrative, and consequence, Sauron exercised control with both subtlety and endurance, ensuring that influence extended across regions, generations, and realms. The interaction of loyalty, ambition, and perception reached its first sustained test as coordinated awareness matured. Questions, discussions, and deliberations intensified among the elves, while mortal leaders' ambitions became more organized and persistent. Sauron's response was a synthesis of observation, intervention, and calibration. He allowed inquiry, tempered rivalry, highlighted consequence, and reinforced alignment. Each engagement, each subtle redirection, each observation contributed to the resilience and adaptability of the lattice. Resistance, rather than undermining stability, became an instrument of refinement, enhancing the depth and subtlety of influence. Through this convergence of observation and opposition, Sauron's identity as the Dark Lord crystallized. No longer merely an unseen guide, He now functioned as strategist, manipulator, and arbiter of consequence. The rings served as instruments of perception, empowerment, and subtle guidance. Awareness, ambition, and inquiry became threads in a lattice of enduring influence. Each interaction, each hesitation, each alignment or misalignment was observed, analyzed, and integrated into a dynamic system of control. The balance between autonomy and alignment, perception and consequence, curiosity and loyalty, became both art and science, defining the enduring architecture of his authority. By the close of this chapter, the first coordinated opposition had been integrated into the lattice of influence. Scrutiny among the elves, initiative among mortal leaders, and the emergent networks of perception and collaboration had been observed, guided, and absorbed into the system. Resistance was refined, autonomy preserved, and alignment reinforced. Sauron's mastery of indirect control, patient orchestration, and the integration of perception, consequence, and ambition had reached a level of sophistication that would endure across the ages. His persona as the Dark Lord, fully attuned to the dynamics of loyalty, opposition, and the orchestration of consequence, was now fully realized, preparing the stage for the decisive confrontations that would define the Second Age. The next chapter will trace the escalation of alliances, the first open confrontations, and the decisive actions Sauron employs to consolidate influence. We will witness the interplay of ambition, resistance, and perception, the crystallization of loyalty and opposition, and the careful orchestration that will shape the destinies of elves, men, and the emerging shadow that will come to dominate the age. The culmination of decades of subtle orchestration and patient guidance now approached its inevitable manifestation. Sauron, having cultivated influence across realms, generations, and ambitions, observed the first open alignments and confrontations with a quiet, deliberate focus. Among the elves, councils convened with unprecedented formality, their deliberations no longer mere speculation, but organized investigation. Artisans, scholars, and leaders combined insight, skill, and reflection to examine the patterns they had long sensed. Yet their conclusions, while incisive, remained framed by the narrative and constraints Sauron had so carefully established. Each move, each debate, each moment of hesitation was observed, analyzed, and integrated into the lattice of influence, extending both awareness and control simultaneously. The rings, distributed with foresight across realms and races, now functioned as instruments of both empowerment and subtle observation. Mortal leaders in Numenor, emboldened by authority and inspired by perceived opportunity, began to act with increasing independence. Yet each step was anticipated, each initiative subtly guided, each perception managed to preserve alignment with broader objectives. Sauron's mastery of indirect control allowed him to transform apparent divergence into reinforcement, initiative into cohesion, and scrutiny into insight. In every corner of the world, perception and consequence intertwined seamlessly, demonstrating the enduring potency of patient orchestration over overt domination. Among the elves, the first genuine confrontations emerged, not as acts of rebellion, but as organized inquiry. Leaders challenged assumptions, debated consequences, and tested the boundaries of authority. Sauron, perceiving both risk and opportunity, guided these interactions with a precision that was almost imperceptible. Questions were framed to reinforce alignment, Disagreements managed to strengthen collaboration, and challenges redirected to preserve the integrity of the lattice. Through this subtle orchestration, scrutiny became a mechanism of refinement, observation, a tool for calibration, and apparent independence, a vector of enduring influence. In Numenor, ambition took on a more coordinated and deliberate form. Mortal leaders, recognizing the limits of counsel and the possibilities presented by the rings, sought to expand authority, assert initiative, and test precedent. Sauron responded not with coercion, but with layered guidance, selective disclosure, historical framing, and subtle reinforcement of alignment. Each action, each challenge, each aspiration was absorbed into the lattice of influence, transforming potential disruption into a mechanism of stability and observation. The interplay of initiative and consequence became a living system, adaptive and resilient, capable of integrating scrutiny, rivalry, and ambition without fracturing coherence. The orchestration of rivalry and trust reached new heights. Among the elves, complementary skills were combined, tension transformed into constructive collaboration, and insight emerged through careful calibration of discussion and reflection. Mortal leaders, guided by narrative and consequence, exercised ambition in ways that reinforced long-term objectives while preserving the perception of autonomy. In both realms, Sauron's guidance operated invisibly, shaping the flow of thought, action, and perception with a subtlety that rendered his influence virtually unassailable. Resistance, when expressed, became a mechanism for testing loyalty, refining alignment, and deepening engagement with the lattice. The rings themselves now revealed their dual purpose with clarity. Beyond empowerment, they served as instruments of perception, insight, and subtle guidance. Patterns of reasoning, tendencies of ambition, and vulnerabilities of pride were observed and integrated into subsequent interventions. The elves' intellectual engagement, once a source of potential disruption, now reinforced cohesion and collaboration. Mortal leaders' aspirations, once independent, now aligned with broader design through selective reinforcement and calibrated guidance. Each artifact became a nexus where perception, action, and consequence converged, extending both influence and awareness across realms. The first sustained challenges to Sauron's orchestration demonstrated the resilience of indirect control. Coordinated scrutiny among the elves, deliberate ambition among mortal leaders, and the subtle assertion of independence were all observed, guided, and integrated. Each apparent divergence became a vector for refinement, each question a mechanism for reinforcement, and each interaction a node in a lattice that spanned regions, generations, and species. Through patient calibration and careful orchestration, resistance was absorbed into a system of enduring influence, illustrating the power of subtlety, perception, and consequence over overt confrontation. Sauron's understanding of narrative, perception, and consequence now reached full maturity. The framing of history, the presentation of precedent, and the management of ethical reflection ensured that independent action remained aligned with long-term strategy. Elves perceived discovery as collective reasoning. Mortals interpreted patterns as cultural and historical inevitability, and both operated within the channels he had established. In this synthesis, choice, initiative, and reflection were preserved, while outcomes remained subtly guided, demonstrating the sophistication and endurance of patient orchestration. The lattice of influence now encompassed not only perception and consequence, but also the moral and philosophical dimensions of action. Sauron observed how pride, curiosity, and ethical reflection could be harnessed as instruments of alignment. Leaders and artisans exercised judgment, debated consequences, and engaged with autonomy. Yet their actions were harmonized with the broader objectives of the lattice. The balance of autonomy and guidance, perception and consequence, inquiry and loyalty had been perfected to a degree that rendered overt confrontation unnecessary, preserving both dignity and agency, while reinforcing alignment. As the lattice matured, patterns of collaboration and opposition crystallized into organized networks. Among the elves, skill and insight were coordinated. Among mortal leaders, ambition and initiative were directed without overt coercion. Sauron observed the emergence of these networks, noting their resilience, adaptability, and capacity for self-reinforcement. Challenges were absorbed, rivalry harnessed, and scrutiny transformed into instruments of observation and alignment. The convergence of perception, action, and consequence produced a system of influence that was both dynamic and enduring, capable of withstanding even the most coordinated forms of inquiry or ambition. The orchestration of this phase revealed the enduring principles that would define Sauron's dominion. Influence is most resilient when autonomy appears intact, curiosity is engaged constructively, and consequence is integrated seamlessly with perception. Resistance, rather than undermining authority, can reinforce alignment if managed with subtlety and precision. Narrative framing, historical precedent, and selective disclosure serve to guide thought without coercion. The orchestration of ambition, scrutiny, and loyalty produces a lattice of influence capable of spanning realms and generations. In this synthesis, the Dark Lord's strategy had achieved its full form, patient, subtle, and virtually unassailable. By the close of this chapter, the lattice of influence had reached its apex. Coordinated awareness among the elves, structured ambition among mortal leaders, and the subtle orchestration of perception, action, and consequence had been fully integrated into a system of enduring control. The rings of power, the management of rivalry, the calibration of loyalty, and the orchestration of scrutiny all converged in a harmonious lattice that extended across space, time, and consciousness. Sauron's persona as the Dark Lord, fully realized and attuned to the dynamics of alignment, resistance, and consequence, had been solidified. As this age drew toward its decisive moments, the stage was set for the conflicts, alliances, and ultimate confrontations that would define the Second Age. The foundation of influence, patient orchestration, and subtle guidance would determine the fates of elves, men, and the lands themselves. The careful weaving of autonomy, loyalty, and perception would confront the tangible realities of ambition and resistance, testing the lattice in ways both visible and unseen. Sauron, now fully established as the Dark Lord, awaited these events with the calm assurance of one whose design had endured centuries of scrutiny, reflection, and subtle challenge, prepared to guide consequence, orchestrate outcome, and shape history itself. The culmination of decades of subtle orchestration now converged with the first tangible manifestations of conflict. Sauron, observing from the shadows of influence he had so meticulously cultivated, perceived the intricate interplay of ambition, loyalty, and perception as it began to express itself in action. Among the elves, councils moved from deliberation to coordinated decision, articulating strategies that reflected both insight and emergent awareness of a guiding hand, though its identity remained obscured. Artisans and leaders, once content with private reflection, now engaged in collective analysis, weaving patterns of thought that probed deeper than ever before. Each move, hesitation, and conjecture was observed by Sauron with the precision of one who understood the rhythms of both intellect and desire, integrating every nuance into the lattice of influence he had built. The rings of power, long instruments of subtle guidance, revealed their dual function with heightened clarity. Empowerment and observation were inseparable. Through them, Sauron monitored ambition, discerned tendencies of pride, and measured susceptibility to influence. Mortal leaders in Numenor, emboldened by authority and the allure of mastery, acted with increasing coordination, testing both precedent and counsel. Yet even in apparent independence, their initiatives were guided subtly, calibrated through narrative framing, historical precedent, and selective reinforcement. Each act, whether perceived as autonomous or influenced, strengthened the lattice, demonstrating the enduring potency of subtle orchestration over overt coercion. Emerging opposition among the elves began to express itself in more deliberate actions. Councils debated with a new-found intensity, scrutinizing artifacts, traditions, and outcomes. Questions once private were now articulated collectively, forming patterns that could have threatened alignment if left unchecked. Sauron, understanding both the promise and risk of such coordination, guided deliberations through calibrated ambiguity, selective suggestion, and the framing of precedent. By allowing discovery to appear autonomous, he preserved the perception of agency while steering outcomes. Rivalry, curiosity, and ethical reflection were transformed into instruments of cohesion, reinforcing the resilience of the lattice even in the face of coordinated scrutiny. In Numenor, ambition reached a critical juncture. Leaders tested limits, explored opportunity, and asserted influence in ways that approached the boundaries of Sauron's orchestration. These acts of initiative, while bold, were anticipated and managed with precision. Counsel was framed as historical reflection, consequence was demonstrated through subtle narrative, and reinforcement was applied strategically to maintain alignment. Independence was not suppressed, but integrated into the lattice, producing an adaptive system in which resistance became a tool for refinement rather than disruption. The careful orchestration of consequence and perception ensured that loyalty endured even amid the assertion of autonomy. The interplay of trust, rivalry, and perception deepened further. Among the elves, complementary skill sets began to coalesce into formalized networks of collaboration. Sauron observed the emerging hierarchies, the dynamics of influence, and the flow of information, guiding interactions subtly to prevent fracture while encouraging insight. Rivalries were harnessed as constructive tension, disagreements became opportunities for refinement, and curiosity was channeled toward productive inquiry. In mortal realms, ambition and initiative were similarly directed through subtle reinforcement, ensuring that personal aspiration aligned with collective objectives. The lattice of influence absorbed and transformed potential discord into structural strength. As challenges intensified, Sauron refined the management of autonomy and perception. Awareness of external orchestration had matured sufficiently that careful framing was essential. By controlling the presentation of information, emphasizing patterns as natural convergence, and highlighting discovery as emergent, he preserved the illusion of independence while maintaining alignment. Elves reasoned collectively. Mortals interpreted outcomes as historical inevitability, and both remained coordinated with strategic objectives. This integration of perception, consequence, and narrative framed not only action, but expectation, creating a lattice resilient to scrutiny, curiosity, and ambition alike. The orchestration of ethical reflection became increasingly sophisticated. Pride, curiosity, and initiative were not suppressed, but guided, shaping decisions that reinforced the lattice while preserving agency. Leaders exercised judgment, debated outcomes, and weighed consequence, yet their choices remained in alignment with broader design. The synthesis of autonomy and guidance, perception and consequence, curiosity and loyalty became the defining principle of Sauron's indirect control. Resistance, rather than fracturing cohesion, was absorbed into the system, tested and refined, demonstrating the enduring strength of subtle, patient orchestration over overt assertion of power. The lattice now functioned as an integrated system, capable of both anticipating and adapting to emergent patterns. Among the elves, networks of insight, skill, and reflection emerged, reinforcing collaboration while providing feedback to the lattice. Mortal leaders, guided through narrative, precedent, and subtle influence, exercised initiative without fracturing alignment. The rings, acting as both instruments and sensors, transmitted information that allowed Sauron to calibrate intervention with unprecedented precision. Observation, perception, consequence, and guidance converged into a dynamic system of enduring influence, demonstrating both resilience and adaptability. Sauron's engagement with this phase of overt activity revealed the potency of indirect control. Coordinated scrutiny, structured initiative, and emergent networks of influence were not threats, but tools. Questions became mechanisms for refinement, rivalry, a medium for cohesion, and independent action, an instrument of alignment. Each intervention, each observation, and each subtle redirection reinforced the lattice while preserving autonomy. In this system, power was exercised not through force, but through the patient orchestration of consequence, perception, and narrative, establishing a dominion that could endure both scrutiny and ambition. The first overt alignments and confrontations illuminated the principles of narrative and consequence that underpinned the lattice. By presenting events as natural convergence, emphasizing discovery as collective insight, and framing consequence as ethical deliberation, Sauron guided perception without direct assertion. The elves' reasoning was experienced as independent inquiry, mortal ambition interpreted as historical or cultural inevitability. Both, however, remained harmonized with strategic objectives. In this integration, choice, initiative, and reflection became instruments of alignment, demonstrating the sophistication and durability of indirect control at the highest level. By the close of this chapter, the lattice of influence had weathered the first tangible manifestations of conflict. Coordinated awareness among the elves, ambitious initiative among mortal leaders, and the emergence of structured networks of action and scrutiny had all been observed, guided, and absorbed into the system. Resistance became refinement, independence became alignment, and scrutiny became insight. The rings of power, ethical reflection, rivalry, and consequence converged in a dynamic lattice that spanned realms, generations, and consciousness. Sauron's mastery of subtle orchestration, patient guidance, and the integration of perception with consequence had reached its zenith. The stage was now set for the decisive consolidation of power that would define the Second Age. Alliances, conflicts, and coordinated resistance would confront the lattice of influence, testing both its resilience and adaptability. Sauron, fully realized as the Dark Lord, would orchestrate these events with a precision that integrated perception, ambition, and consequence. The fates of elves, men, and the very lands themselves now hung in the balance, guided by subtle yet unyielding influence. The culmination of patient orchestration, ethical calibration, and strategic foresight was poised to reshape history, establishing patterns that would endure long after the first open confrontations had passed.